The air itself tasted like ash. It clung to the back of Alan's throat with every breath he took, a bitter metallic film that coated his tongue and reminded him of everything he had burned to get here. He stood atop the highest spire of the imperial palace, though it was no longer an imperial palace. It was his throne room now, his dominion. Behind him, stretching to the horizon, the capital city, once a gleaming jewel of magic and civilization, lay in smoldering ruin. Towers of marble and enchanted steel had been reduced to jagged skeletons reaching for a smoke-choked sky. The streets, meticulously designed over centuries, were now rivers of rubble and silent ash. He had won. The thought echoed in his mind, hollow and mocking. The Great War, the decade-long conflict that had consumed continents, that had turned fellow students into enemies and friends into corpses. It was over. The alliance of kingdoms had fallen. The church's holy warriors had been scattered. The Mage Council, those arrogant old men who had looked down on him for his common birth, had been erased from existence. Every single one of his enemies had been crushed beneath the heel of the Demon Lord. And Alan felt absolutely nothing. He stood there, a figure clad in armor as black as oblivion. The armor fused to his flesh years ago by rituals he no longer wanted to remember. Mana, dense and volatile, crackled around his form like a living storm, warping the air and making the very stones beneath his feet groan in protest. He was the most powerful being on the continent. He was also the loneliest. His crimson eyes, glowing faintly in the gloom, stared down at the only thing in this world that still held any meaning for him. She was in his arms, Seraphina. Her white robes, the sacred vestments of the Saintess, were stained with soot and something darker, something that made Alan's chest constrict with a pain so fierce it rivaled any wound he had ever received in battle. Her silver hair, once radiant like moonlight on water, was tangled and matted. Her face, peaceful in a way that terrified him more than any scream, was cold, so terribly, achingly cold. He had searched for her. When the final battle turned and the enemy lines broke, when his generals screamed for pursuit and his commanders begged him to press the advantage and end the war forever, Alan had turned away from victory. He had run. The Demon Lord, the scourge of the continent, had run through burning corridors and collapsing halls, his heart pounding with a fear that no army had ever been able to instill in him. He had found her here in what used to be the Imperial Chapel. She wasn't fighting. She wasn't leading the last stand he had expected from the church's greatest weapon. She was simply lying here, alone, a single, terrible wound over her heart, a wound that could only have been made by magic so dark it had been outlawed for 1,000 years. Magic that he recognized, magic that had once been wielded by someone he trusted. A sob tried to tear itself from his throat, but it came out as a ragged, broken sound, more animal than human. He sank to his knees, the armor screeching against the stone, and gathered her closer, cradling her against his chest as if he could somehow warm her back to life with his despair. "Seraphina," he whispered, his voice a hoarse rasp. "No, no, please, not you, anyone but you." The memories came unbidden, crashing over him in waves that threatened to drown what was left of his sanity. He saw her as she had been 20 years ago on the very first day at the Royal Magic Academy, a skinny, timid girl with dirt on her cheek and holes in her second-hand robes. The noble children had circled her like wolves, mocking her commoner origins, her lack of pedigree, her pathetic mana reserve. Alan, at that time a bitter and ambitious boy desperate to claw his way out of poverty, had watched from the shadows. He had done nothing. He had walked away. And yet, she had been the one person in that entire viper's nest of ambition and betrayal who had ever shown him genuine kindness. A stolen bread roll when he had no money for food, a whispered encouragement before a difficult exam, a smile, small and hesitant, that reached her eyes and made him feel, for just a moment, like he wasn't completely alone. He had repaid that kindness by rising through the ranks, by making alliances with the very nobles who had tormented her, by forgetting her existence entirely in his pursuit of power. And when the war came, when the kingdoms fractured and old friends became mortal enemies, she had chosen a different path. She had become the Saintess, the symbol of hope, the light that opposed his darkness. But she had never stopped trying to save him. Even at the end, when his armies surrounded the capital, when his generals promised to raze the city to the ground, she had sent him messages, pleas, begging him to stop, to remember who he had been, to find another way. He had ignored them all, convinced that only total victory could bring peace. And now she was dead, killed not by his hand but by the very people she had tried to protect. The corrupt nobles, the paranoid church officials, they had seen her attempts at negotiation as treason. They had silenced her before she could try. A tear, warm and impossibly fragile, slid from Alan's cheek and fell onto Seraphina's face. It traced a clean path through the grime, a single line of moisture on the pallor of death. And then he saw it. From the corner of her eye where the tear had landed, a single droplet formed. Not his tear, hers. A final, impossible tear, squeezed from a body that should have no moisture left. A last gift from a soul that refused to abandon him even in death. It was warm. It landed on the back of his hand, and the world ended. The universe didn't just twist, it screamed. It folded in on itself, reality bending like a sheet of paper crushed in a giant's fist. Alan felt time shatter around him, felt the years peel away like layers of skin, felt his very essence being ripped apart and reassembled by forces beyond mortal comprehension. Colors that didn't exist in nature flooded his vision. Sounds that predated creation thundered. He tried to hold on to her to keep her body close, but she dissolved into light, into warmth, into nothing. And then there was only darkness, a deep, endless, silent darkness that stretched for what felt like both an instant and an eternity. A sound broke through the void. Creaking. The high-pitched, rhythmic squeak of old wood shifting under weight. It was accompanied by another sound, softer but equally distinct. Breathing. Not his own. Dozens of others close by in the rhythm of deep sleep. Alan's eyes snapped open. He was staring at a ceiling. Not the vaulted, black marble ceiling of his throne room, but a low, wooden ceiling with dark stains in the corners where rain had leaked through over the decade. The beams were familiar. The faint, musty smell of old books and cheap candle wax was familiar. The lumpy mattress beneath him, digging into his spine in ways he had forgotten, was painfully, impossibly familiar. He sat up so fast his vision swam. A dormitory. He was in a dormitory. Rows of simple wooden beds stretched out on either side, most of them occupied by sleeping figures. Boys his age, or close to it, wrapped in thin blankets, their faces young and unmarked by the horrors of war. Sunlight, pale and weak, filtered through a grimy window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. This couldn't be real. It was a hallucination, a final cruel trick of a dying mind. He had seen this room before, slept in this bed before, 20 years ago. It was the first-year dormitory at the Royal Magic Academy. His hands flew to his chest. The black armor was gone. Instead, he felt coarse linen, a simple nightshirt. His skin, where he could see it, was smooth and unblemished, unmarked by the rituals that had transformed him into a demon. His hands, once gnarled and scarred by decades of warfare, were the hands of a youth, slender, untested. He scrambled out of bed, his bare feet slapping against the cold stone floor. A few of the sleeping boys stirred, mumbled, and rolled over. Alan ignored them. He stumbled toward a small, cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the far wall, his heart hammering against his ribs with a violence that threatened to crack them. The face that stared back at him was not the face of the demon lord. It was younger, so much younger. The hard lines carved by grief and rage were gone. The cruel set of the jaw, the dead emptiness in the eyes, replaced by the soft, unformed features of a boy on the cusp of manhood. Brown hair, slightly disheveled from sleep. Brown eyes, wide with shock and something that felt terrifyingly like hope. He raised a trembling hand to his cheek. The reflection did the same. The touch was real. The cold glass was real. The faint scratch on his index finger from a training accident in his first week. It was there, barely visible, the same scar he remembered getting. It was real. He was real. And then the memories hit. Not just the memories of his past life, not the slow recall of an old man reminiscing. These were fresh, raw, crashing into his consciousness with the force of a tidal wave. He remembered everything, every battle, every betrayal, every face of every friend he had lost and every enemy he had made. He remembered the taste of ash and the feeling of Seraphina's cold body in his arms. He remembered her tears, and he remembered what day this was. The entrance exams. He stumbled back from the mirror, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. This was the day, the very first day, the day he had arrived at the academy, full of ambition and arrogance, ready to claw his way to the top. The day he had first seen her, a girl with dirt on her cheek and holes in her robes, standing alone in the courtyard as the noble children circled her like wolves. In his past life he had watched from the shadows. He had done nothing. He had walked away. But now he had been given something impossible. A second chance. A chance to undo every mistake, to save every friend, to prevent every tragedy. A chance to save her. He didn't know how or why this had happened. He didn't understand the power of her tears or the magic that had torn him from the future and hurled him back 2 decades. He didn't care. Alan turned from the mirror, his young face suddenly hardening with an expression that looked profoundly out of place on a 16-year-old boy. It was the expression of a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer and had decided with absolute finality that it would not happen again. Not this time. He pulled on his simple student robes, the fabric rough and cheap against his skin, and ran. He ran through the dormitory, past the waking students who called out confused greeting, down the creaking wooden stairs, and out into the crisp morning air. The academy courtyard stretched before him, a vast expanse of manicured lawns and ancient stone pathway, dominated by the towering spires of the main hall. Students milled about everywhere, a sea of colored robes indicating their social standing, the rich silks of the noble, the fine wool of the merchant class, and the rough, patched cloth of the commoner. His eyes scanned the crowd frantically, searching, desperate. And then he saw her. She was exactly as he remembered, small for her age, almost fragile look, with silver hair that had been hastily tied back, and a face that might have been pretty if it wasn't pinched with anxiety. Her robes were a disgrace, faded, mended in at least 3 places with mismatched thread, and slightly too large for her thin frame. And she was surrounded. 3 boys, their robes obviously expensive, their postures radiating entitled cruelty, had cornered her against a low stone wall. One of them, a blond youth with a sneer that Alan recognized from 100 future battles, was speaking loudly enough for half the courtyard to hear. Honestly, I don't know why they even allow your kind to apply. The entrance exams are wasted on commoners. You'll fail anyway. Your mana reserves are probably non-existent. I'm surprised you can even light a candle. The other 2 laughed. The girl, Seraphina, shrank back against the wall, her eyes fixed on the ground, her hands trembling at her side. She didn't speak. She didn't defend herself. She just took it as she had always taken it, because she had learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse. In his past life, Alan had watched this scene from a distance. He had felt a flicker of sympathy, quickly extinguished by his own desperate need to fit in, to rise, to never be the target of such cruelty himself. He had turned away and walked toward the exam hall, telling himself it wasn't his problem. He would never forgive himself for that. But this time he didn't watch. He didn't turn away. Alan walked forward. His steps were calm, measured, the gait of someone who had faced down armies and never flinched. The crowd of students seemed to part around him instinctively, though none of them knew why. There was something in the air around this boy, something that made the hairs on the backs of their necks stand up. He reached the group just as the blond boy reached out to grab Seraphina's chin, forcing her to look at him. And what do you think you're wearing? Did you steal that from a beggar? Honestly, some people have no. Remove your hand. The voice was quiet, perfectly calm, but it carried a weight, a depth of command that silenced the entire courtyard. The blond boy froze. He turned, his sneer still in place but his eyes suddenly uncertain, and found himself looking at a brown-haired boy of average height and unremarkable appearance. Nothing special, nothing threatening. And yet there was something in those brown eyes, something ancient and cold and absolutely terrifying. For just a fraction of a second, the blond boy thought he saw a shadow behind them, a shape of darkness and flame that made his soul quiver. Then it was gone. Alan smiled. It was a pleasant smile, the smile of a friendly classmate. I said, remove your hand. She's clearly uncomfortable, and we wouldn't want to start the entrance exams with a misunderstanding, would we? The blond boy's hand dropped. He opened his mouth to speak, to bluster, to reassert his dominance, but the words wouldn't come. Something about this commoner, this nobody, had robbed him of his voice. Alan turned away from him as if he no longer existed, dismissing him completely. He faced Seraphina, and his expression changed. The coldness vanished, replaced by something soft, something almost vulnerable. He looked at her the way a man might look at a sunrise he had never expected to see again. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Don't mind them, they're not worth your tears." Seraphina stared at him, her wide violet eyes filled with confusion and a dawning, fragile hope. No one had ever stood up for her before. No one had ever looked at her like that, like she mattered, like she was something precious. "Here," Alan said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, slightly squashed bread roll. His breakfast, saved from the dormitory. "You look hungry. You should eat something before the exam. It's going to be a long day." He held it out to her, the simple offering of a boy who had nothing, to a girl who had even less. And as her small, trembling hand reached out to take it, as their fingers brushed for the first time in this new world, Alan felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. Hoping. The bread roll sat in Seraphina's palm like it was made of gold. She stared at it, then at the boy standing before her, then back at the bread. Her violet eyes, wide with a confusion that bordered on suspicion, searched his face for any sign of mockery, any hint that this was some elaborate prank designed to raise her hopes only to dash them harder. She had seen that kind of cruelty before. Nobles would sometimes pretend to befriend a commoner, only to humiliate them publicly when their guard was down. It was a game, a vicious, entertaining game for those who had never known what it felt like to be truly hungry. But this boy's eyes held none of that. They held something else entirely, something she couldn't name or understand. He looked at her the way she imagined an older brother might if she had ever had one. Protective, gentle, and beneath that, buried so deep she almost missed it, there was a shadow of something ancient and sad. "Go on," he said softly. "It's not much, but it's fresh. The dormitory steward bakes them every morning." Her fingers curled around the bread. It was still warm. "Why?" The word escaped her lips before she could stop it, small and fragile. "Why are you? I mean, you don't even know me. I'm nobody. You're Seraphina," he interrupted, and something flickered in those brown eyes. Pain, loss. It was gone before she could identify it. "And you're going to pass the entrance exams today. I can tell." She blinked. "How do you know my name?" For just a fraction of a second, the boy's composure cracked. A flash of panic crossed his features, quickly masked. "I heard those nobles saying it earlier, when they were," he trailed off, gesturing vaguely at the retreating forms of the blond boy and his friends, who were now hurrying toward the exam hall with their tails metaphorically between their legs. Seraphina accepted this explanation because she had no reason not to, but something nagged at the back of her mind. The way he had said her name. It wasn't the way a stranger said a name they'd just overheard. It was the way someone said a name they'd whispered in prayer, in grief, in desperate hope. She took a small bite of the bread. It was the best thing she had tasted in weeks. "I'm Alan," the boy said, offering a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We should probably head to the exam hall. The written test starts soon, and they lock the doors promptly." He began walking, and after a moment's hesitation, Seraphina fell into step beside him. She was acutely aware of the stares following, the whispered comments from the gathered students. A commoner boy walking with a commoner girl. Nothing special. And yet, there was something about the way Alan moved that drew attention. He walked like someone who owned the ground beneath his feet, despite his cheap robes and unremarkable appearance. The exam hall was a vast, circular chamber dominated by rows of wooden desks, each one equipped with a blank scroll and an inkstone. High above, a domed ceiling painted with constellations watched over the proceedings. At the front of the hall, on a raised dais, sat 3 figures in ornate robes. The examiners, their faces stern and unreadable. Students filed in, filling the desks according to an unspoken hierarchy. Nobles at the front, where they could be seen. Merchant-class children in the middle. Commoners at the very back near the doors, as far from the examiners as possible. Alan guided Seraphina to a desk near the back wall and took the one beside her. She noticed, with some surprise, that he had chosen a position that placed him between her and the rest of the hall. Protective. Again. The head examiner, a severe-looking woman with iron-gray hair and spectacles perched on a hawkish nose, rose to her feet. Her voice, amplified by a minor projection spell, cut through the murmuring like a blade. "Welcome, applicants, to the Royal Magic Academy entrance examinations. You have been deemed eligible to test based on your preliminary submissions. Today, you will prove whether that eligibility was deserved." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room. "The written examination will test your theoretical knowledge of magical principles, runic arrays, and elemental theory. You have 3 hours. Begin." Quills scratched against parchment as the examination scrolls magically revealed their question. Alan stared at his, a strange expression crossing his face. Nostalgia, amusement, and something else. A cold, calculating focus that seemed wildly out of place on a 16-year-old. He knew these questions, every single one. He had answered them before, 20 years ago, and then spent 2 decades learning magic that made this entrance exam look like a child's coloring book. The theory of elemental resonance, the 7 principles of runic containment, the mathematical framework for teleportation arrays. He could answer them in his sleep, but he couldn't answer them perfectly. The thought crystallized in his mind with absolute clarity. If he scored too high, if he drew the attention of the examiners, of the professors, of the nobles who sponsored promising students, he would be watched, investigated. His background would be scrutinized, and questions would be asked that he couldn't answer. How did a commoner boy from a backwater village achieve a perfect score on the most difficult entrance exam in the kingdom? How did he demonstrate knowledge beyond even what the academy taught? In his past life, he had scored in the top 10%, good enough to earn a place, not good enough to draw unwanted attention. It had been the perfect strategy then. It was the perfect strategy now. He began to write, his quill moving with practiced ease. But he held back. He deliberately omitted the most advanced insights, simplified his explanations, made a few minor errors that a gifted but untrained commoner might make. He aimed for the top 15%, respectable, unremarkable. Beside him, he could hear Seraphina's quill scratching frantically. He risked a glance. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her lips moving silently as she worked through problem. She was smart. He remembered that. In his past life, she had scored in the top 20%, good enough to earn a place but not good enough to earn respect. The nobles had still mocked her. The professors had still overlooked her. Not this time. The 3 hours passed in a blur of ink and concentration. When the examination scrolls magically rolled themselves up and floated to the front of the hall, Alan leaned back in his chair, allowing himself a small, satisfied smile. Phase 1 was complete. The practical examination was next. Students were led to a different chamber, this one dominated by a massive crystalline orb mounted on a pedestal of black obsidian. The mana measurement crystal. It was used to assess an applicant's raw magical potential, their elemental affinity, and their control. In Alan's past life, he had approached this test with desperate ambition, pouring every ounce of his power into the crystal, desperate to prove himself. He had scored in the top 5% for raw potential, which had marked him as a target for the nobles who feared commoner competition. This time, he would be more careful. One by one, students approached the crystal, placed their hands upon its surface, and watched as it glowed with colors representing their affinity: red for fire, blue for water, green for earth, white for wind, and the rare purple for lightning, gold for light, or black for shadow. The intensity of the glow indicated their potential. The blond boy from the courtyard, Cedric, Alan now remembered, a future sword master and one of his greatest enemies, approached the crystal with arrogant confidence. When his hands touched the surface, it blazed with brilliant red light, so bright that several students shaded their eyes. The examiners nodded approvingly, making notes on their scrolls. Potential, A rank, the head examiner announced. Affinity, fire with secondary affinity for lightning. Impressive. Cedric strode back to his place among the nobles, shooting a smug glance toward the back of the hall, toward Seraphina. She was trembling when her name was called. Alan watched her walk to the crystal, her small frame seeming even smaller against the massive obsidian pedestal. She placed her hands on its surface with the air of someone expecting rejection, expecting failure, expecting the universe to confirm what she had always believed, that she was nothing, that she didn't belong, that she should just give up and go back to whatever impoverished village had spawned her. The crystal remained dark. A titter ran through the noble student, whispers, mocking comment. Seraphina's shoulders hunched, and she began to pull her hands away. And then the crystal exploded with light. It wasn't just light, it was fire. Brilliant, golden-white fire that roared from the crystal's core and filled the entire chamber with blinding radiance. The examiners stumbled back, shielding their eyes. Students screamed. The temperature in the room spiked so dramatically that sweat broke out on every brow. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. Seraphina stood frozen, her hand still pressed against the now dark crystal, her face a mask of absolute shock. She had no idea what had just happened. Neither did anyone else, except for one person. Alan. He stared at her, his heart pounding with a mixture of joy and terror. In his past life, Seraphina's potential had been deliberately suppressed. The church had found her young, trained her slowly, carefully, hiding her true power until she was ready to be unveiled as their Saintess. But here now, with no one to hide her, the crystal had revealed the truth. She was a natural-born solar maid, a wielder of pure light magic, the rarest and most powerful affinity in existence. In the wrong hands, she would be a weapon. In the right hands, she would be a savior. In Alan's hands, she would be protected. What was that? The head examiner breathed, her professional composure shattered. That kind of radiance. I've only seen it once before, when the Archmage himself was tested as a youth. The other examiners were whispering urgently among themselves. Alan could guess what they were saying. This changed everything. A commoner girl with potential that rivaled the greatest mages in the kingdom, she would be watched, cultivated, perhaps exploited. He needed to act fast. When Seraphina returned to her seat, still trembling, still bewildered, he leaned close and whispered in her ear, "Don't let them see you're afraid. Don't let them define you. You have a gift, Seraphina, a gift that no one can take away. Hold on to that." She looked at him, her violet eyes searching his face for answers he couldn't give. What just happened? Alan, what was that light? He smiled, and this time there was no shadow in it, only warmth. That was you, finally showing the world what I've always known. She didn't ask how he could possibly have known anything about her. She was too overwhelmed, too confused, too flooded with emotions she couldn't name, but she remembered his words. She held onto them like a lifeline. When Alan's name was called, he approached the crystal with the calm, measured steps of someone who had done this 100 times before. He placed his hands on its surface and felt the familiar pull, the connection between his soul and the artifact that measured it. He thought about his past life, the decades of war, the faces of the dead, the cold body in his arms. He thought about this life, Seraphina's smile, the warmth of the bread roll in her hand, the chance to do it all over again. And he held back. The crystal glowed a steady, unremarkable blue, water affinity, above average intensity but nothing extraordinary, B+ potential, respectable, unremarkable, exactly what he wanted. The examiners made their notes without particular interest. Another commoner with decent potential, worth watching perhaps, but not worth obsessing over. Their attention was still fixed on the girl who had blazed like a sun. Alan returned to his seat, satisfied. The pieces were falling into place. He had established himself as a minor talent, unworthy of the Predator's attention. Seraphina had revealed herself as a major talent, which would bring its own dangers, but those were dangers he could anticipate, could prepare for, could protect her from. This time he would not fail her. The examinations concluded, and the results were posted the following morning. Both Alan and Seraphina had passed, their names listed among the new intake of first-year students. Seraphina's name was near the top, highlighted with a small notation indicating exceptional potential. Alan's was in the middle, comfortably anonymous. They found each other in the crowd of new students, surrounded by the chaos of orientation. Seraphina's face lit up when she saw him, a genuine smile breaking through her habitual wariness. "We made it," she said, wonder in her voice. "We actually made it." "We did," Alan agreed, "but the real work starts now. The Academy isn't kind to commoners, Seraphina. They'll test us. They'll try to break us. They'll do everything they can to remind us that we don't belong." Her smile faltered. "I know, I've always known. But they're wrong." Alan's voice was quiet but fierce. "We do belong, not because they allow it but because we earned it, and I'm going to prove that to all of them." He looked at her, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. "Will you help me?" She didn't understand what he was asking. She didn't understand who he really was, or why he had chosen her, or what secrets lurked behind those ancient, sorrowful eyes. But she understood one thing with absolute certainty. This boy had been kind to her when no one else was. He had stood between her and her tormentors. He had given her bread when she was hungry and hope when she had none. "Yes," she said softly, "I'll help you." And in that moment, watching the sunlight catch her silver hair and turn it to spun moonlight, watching the hope kindle in her violet eyes, Alan felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he could be saved too. The academy bells tolled, calling the new students to their first assembly. They walked together toward the main hall, two commoners in a sea of nobles, insignificant and overlooked. But Alan knew the truth. He knew the power that slept within this fragile girl. He knew the monsters that lurked in the hearts of the professors and nobles who smiled down at them. He knew the future, every twist and turn of it, every betrayal and every battle. And this time he was ready. The sun rose over the Royal Magic Academy, painting the ancient spires in shades of gold and rose. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang. The world was young again, full of possibility and promise. And the demon lord, reborn as a boy, walked toward his destiny with a smile on his lips and fire in his heart. The game had begun anew, and this time he would win. The first month at the Royal Magic Academy passed in a blur of lectures, practical training, and the quiet, relentless cruelty of the noble-born students. Alan observed it all with the cold, calculating eyes of a general surveying a battlefield. The social dynamics were exactly as he remembered them. The nobles clustered together in their exclusive groups, the merchant-class children desperately trying to ingratiate themselves with their social superior, and the commoners, scattered and isolated, doing their best to simply survive. The professors, for the most part, turned a blind eye to the casual harassment. In their view, the strong would rise and the weak would fall, and such was the natural order of things. Seraphina, to her credit, was enduring better than Alan had hoped. Her explosive performance on the practical exam had made her a target of both fascination and resentment. Some nobles viewed her as a potential asset, a commoner talent they could recruit to their houses and exploit for their own gain. Others saw her as a threat, an upstart who needed to be put in her place before she forgot the natural hierarchy. But she had Alan. He made sure to walk her to every class, to sit beside her in every lecture, to be a constant, unshakable presence at her side. He didn't draw attention to himself. His performance in classes was consistently good but never exceptional. His practical exercises competent but never brilliant. But he was always there, a wall between her and the worst of the predator. It wasn't enough to stop all of it. The whispers followed her everywhere. Commoner trash, charity case, probably slept with someone on the admissions board. The rumors grew uglier as the weeks passed, and Seraphina grew quieter, her shoulders hunching a little more each day. She didn't complain. She never complained. She simply absorbed the cruelty like it was her due, like she had expected nothing less from the world. Alan watched and waited and planned. He knew exactly who the worst offenders were. He remembered their faces from his past life, the ones who would go on to become generals in the war, or corrupt officials, or simply sadists who enjoyed tormenting those beneath them. He catalogued every slight, every whispered insult, every subtle act of aggression. He would deal with them all in time. But the one he was waiting for, the one he knew would eventually make his move, was Cedric. The blond boy from the entrance exams was exactly as Alan remembered him, arrogant, cruel, and utterly convinced of his own superiority. He was the second son of the Valter family, one of the most powerful noble houses in the kingdom, and he wielded that privilege like a weapon. In his past life, Cedric had become the Empire's sword master, a warrior of legendary skill who had led armies against Alan's forces. He had killed hundreds of Alan's soldiers. He had personally executed friends, comrades, people Alan had loved. And it had all started here, in the academy, with casual cruelty and the slow destruction of a commoner girl's spirit. Alan had watched it happen once. He would not watch it again. The confrontation came on a crisp autumn afternoon, 6 weeks into the semester. Seraphina was walking back from the library, a stack of books clutched to her chest, when Cedric and his entourage intercepted her near the central fountain. Alan was 20 yards behind, having lingered to speak with a professor about an assignment. He saw it happen in perfect, horrible clarity. Cedric stepped into her path and his friends fanned out, blocking any escape. The fountain burbled peacefully behind them, oblivious to the ugliness unfolding before it. "Well, well," Cedric said, his voice carrying that particular blend of amusement and contempt that Alan remembered so well. "If it isn't the little commoner who thinks she's special. Carrying books, are we? How adorable. Tell me, do you actually read, or do you just use them to prop up your bed? Oh wait, commoners don't have beds, do they? Just piles of straw in some hovel somewhere." His friends laughed. Seraphina's face went pale, then red. She tried to step around him, but one of the other nobles moved to block her. "I'm just trying to get to my dormitory," she said quietly. "Please let me pass. Please let me pass," Cedric mimicked in a falsetto. "Oh, listen to that, so polite, so properly deferential. That's the thing about you commoners, you know, you're so good at begging, it's practically bred into you." He reached out and grabbed a book from the top of her stack, holding it up where she couldn't reach it. "What's this? Advanced Runic Theory. Oh, that's precious. You actually think you're smart enough to understand this? You with your second-hand robes and your pathetic little monopool. Give that back." Seraphina's voice trembled, but there was steel beneath it, a spark of the fire Alan knew lived in her heart. "Or what?" Cedric leaned close, his face inches from hers. "What will you do, little commoner? Cry? Run to the professors? We both know they won't do anything. We both know your place here. You're a charity case, a novelty, a little experiment in whether filth can be polished into something presentable. The answer is no, by the way, you can't. You'll always be what you are." He held the book above her head, preparing to drop it into the fountain. Alan moved. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He simply walked forward, his pace unhurried, his expression calm. The crowd of students near the fountain seemed to sense something, parting before him without quite knowing why. By the time Cedric noticed him, Alan was already there, standing between the noble and Seraphina, his brown eyes fixed on Cedric's face with an intensity that made the blond boy take an involuntary step back. "Give her the book," Alan said. His voice was quiet, perfectly level, but there was something beneath it, a weight of command that belonged on a battlefield, not in a schoolyard confrontation. Cedric recovered quickly. His arrogance reasserted itself, and he sneered down at this commoner who dared to challenge him. "Or what? You'll make me. You, with your pathetic B-rank potential and your water affinity. What are you going to do, splash me to death?" His friends laughed, but there was an edge of uncertainty to it now. Something about this boy was wrong. Something about the way he stood, the way he looked at them, made their instincts scream warnings they couldn't articulate. Alan smiled. It was not a nice smile. "In my village," he said slowly, "we had a saying. It doesn't matter how sharp the sword is if the one wielding it doesn't know which end to hold." He took a single step closer, and Cedric, despite himself, stepped back again. "You've been trained with a blade since childhood, haven't you, Cedric? The best instructors money can buy, the finest equipment, and yet I wonder." He let the sentence hang, unfinished. Cedric's face flushed with anger. "You wonder what? Speak, commoner. I'll give you permission." Alan's smile widened. "I wonder if you've ever actually fought anyone who was trying to hurt you, really hurt you, not sparring partners who pull their blows, not servants who let you win, someone who actually wanted to see you bleed." The air between them crackled with tension. Students had gathered now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Word was spreading. A commoner challenging a noble. This was unheard of. This was dangerous. Cedric's hand went to the practice sword at his belt. All students were permitted to carry training weapons on academy ground. "You're challenging me. You, a commoner with no name, no family, no nothing, wants to cross blades with the second sword of the Vaulter house." "I'm not challenging you," Alan said, and there was something almost pitying in his voice. "I'm giving you a chance to walk away, to return her book and apologize, to pretend this never happened. And if I don't," Alan shrugged, "then I'll take the book, one way or another." The crowd held its breath. This was madness. Everyone knew it. Cedric was a prodigy, already being groomed for a future as one of the kingdom's greatest swordsmen. This unknown commoner would be cut to ribbons in seconds. Cedric laughed, a sharp, angry sound. "You're insane, you know that. Actually insane." He tossed the book to one of his friends. "Hold that. I'm going to teach this mongrel a lesson he won't forget." His practiced sword cleared its sheath in a smooth, practiced motion. The blade was wooden, but at this level of training, wood could still break bones, still draw blood, still cause serious injury if the wielder was skilled enough. And Cedric was skilled. In his past life, Alan had watched him fight. He knew exactly how skilled. Seraphina grabbed Alan's arm. "No, Alan, please don't. It's not worth it. It's just a book." He looked at her and his expression softened. "It's not about the book. Then what is it about?" He didn't answer. Instead, he gently removed her hand from his arm and stepped forward to face Cedric. He held out his empty hand. "I don't have a sword," he said mildly. Cedric's grin was vicious. "Then you should have thought of that before you opened your mouth. Someone lend this fool a blade." A student from the crowd, a merchant-class boy with wide eyes, hesitantly offered his practice sword. Alan took it, testing its weight, its balance. It was a cheap thing, mass-produced for training, nothing like the legendary blades he had wielded in his past life. But it would do. It would more than do. Cedric adopted a classic opening stance, his sword held high, his weight balanced perfectly. It was textbook form, exactly as the instructors taught. Beautiful to watch, deadly to face. Alan stood in no stance at all. He simply held the sword loosely at his side, his posture relaxed, almost casual. To the watching students, it looked like the posture of someone who had never held a blade before. To Cedric, it looked like something else entirely, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "In guard," Cedric said and attacked. His first strike was a classic overhead cut, fast and powerful, designed to overwhelm an unprepared opponent. Alan sidestepped, not far, just enough. The wooden blade whistled past his, missing by a hair's breadth. Cedric followed with a horizontal slash, then a thrust, then a combination that had taken him years to master. Alan moved through it all like smoke, never seeming to hurry, never seeming to exert himself. Each attack missed by the smallest possible margin, as if Alan knew exactly where the blade would before it arrived. "What's wrong?" Alan murmured, loud enough for only Cedric. "Your instructors never taught you to fight someone who actually wants to hit back." Cedric's face contorted with rage. He abandoned form entirely, attacking with wild, furious strokes, trying to overwhelm Alan with sheer aggression. It was exactly what Alan had been waiting for. In his past life, Alan had spent decades mastering the blade. He had fought in wars that lasted years, against enemies who made Cedric look like a child playing with a toy. He had learned techniques that had been lost to time, styles that no living master remembered. He had killed more men than Cedric had ever met. He brought all of that knowledge to bear in a single, perfect moment. As Cedric's wild swing left his side exposed, Alan moved. Not fast, not impossibly fast, nothing that would draw suspicion, but perfectly. His sword came up in a short, sharp arc, striking Cedric's wrist with precise force. The blond boy's fingers spasmed and his practiced sword clattered to the ground. Before Cedric could react, before anyone could even process what had happened, Alan's blade was at his throat. The courtyard fell absolutely silent. Alan stood there, the tip of his practiced sword pressed gently against Cedric's skin, his expression as calm as if he had just completed a routine exercise. Cedric stood frozen, his eyes wide, his face pale with shock and something that might have been the first stirrings of real fear. "I told you," Alan said quietly. "Give her the book, apologize, walk away." Cedric's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His friends stared, their own weapons forgotten, their faces masks of disbelief. The gathered students gaped. Somewhere in the back of the crowd, a professor who had arrived too late to intervene watched with narrowed, calculating eyes. Seraphina stood perfectly still, her hands pressed to her mouth, her violet eyes fixed on Alan as if seeing him for the first time. The book was retrieved. It was placed in Seraphina's trembling hands by one of Cedric's friends, who couldn't meet anyone's eyes. Cedric, his pride in tatters, his wrist already beginning to swell, stumbled backward and was led away by his entourage, shooting glances back at Alan that were equal parts hatred and confusion. Alan lowered his sword. He returned it to its owner, who took it with the expression of someone accepting a holy relic. Then he walked to Seraphina and gently took her elbow. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you back to your dormitory." She let him lead her away, through the crowd that parted silently before them. She didn't speak until they were alone, walking along a quiet path lined with autumn-touched trees. "How?" she whispered. Alan glanced at her. "How what? How did you do that?" "Cedric is. He's one of the best swordsmen in our year. He's been training since he could walk. And you made him look like a child." Alan was silent for a long moment. He wanted to tell her the truth. He wanted to explain everything, the future, the war, the death, the tears that had thrown him back through time. But he couldn't. Not yet. Not until she was ready, until she was strong enough to bear it. "I grew up in a rough village," he said finally. "You learn to fight or you don't survive. And I've always been good at reading people." Cedric telegraphs his moves. He's been taught to fight in a certain way against certain opponents. He's never had to adapt. I just saw what he was going to do before he did it. It was a lie. It was also, in a strange way, the truth. He had seen Cedric's moves before he made them, not because he was psychic, but because he had watched Cedric fight in a dozen battles over 2 decades. He knew Cedric's style better than Cedric himself did. Seraphina didn't look convinced, but she didn't push. Instead, she stopped walking and turned to face him fully. The setting sun caught her silver hair, turning it to flame, and for a moment, Alan saw the Saintess she would become. The power, the grace, the unshakable faith. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you keep protecting me? You didn't know me before the entrance exams. You had no reason to help me, and yet from the very first day you've been there, standing between me and the rest of the world." Her eyes searched his face. "Why, Alan?" He looked at her, and for a moment the mask slipped. She saw something in his eyes then, something ancient and weary and filled with a grief so profound it took her breath away. "Because I should have done it before," he said quietly. "Because I didn't once and I've regretted it every day since." She didn't understand. She couldn't. But she heard the truth in his voice, felt the weight of his words like a physical presence. "Thank you," she whispered. Alan smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. "You don't have to thank me, just promise me something. Anything. Promise me you won't let them break you. The nobles, the professors, the whole system, they'll try. They'll try to make you feel small, to convince you that you don't belong. Don't believe you're stronger than they are. You're stronger than you know." Seraphina looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I promise." They walked the rest of the way in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, the silence of two people who didn't need words to understand each other. When they reached her dormitory, she paused at the door. "Alan." "Yes." "Whatever secret you're carrying, whenever you're ready to tell me, I'll listen, and I won't run." Before he could respond, she slipped inside, leaving him alone in the gathering dusk. He stood there for a long time, staring at the closed door, feeling something warm and fragile bloom in his chest. It had been so long since anyone had looked at him like that, so long since anyone had offered trust without demanding something in return. Maybe, he thought, maybe this time would be different. Maybe this time he could save them all. But even as the hope kindled in his heart, the cold voice of experience whispered warning. Cedric would not forget this humiliation. His family would not ignore it, and there were others watching now, professors, nobles, people who had noticed a commoner boy with impossible skill. The game was just beginning, and Alan knew, with the certainty of someone who had lived through it all before, that the hardest battles were yet to come. He turned away from the dormitory and walked into the night, the stars wheeling overhead, the future stretching before him like an open road. Behind him, the academy lights glittered, beautiful and treacherous. And somewhere in the darkness, forces were beginning to move that would shape the destiny of them all. The night was Alan's true domain. While the academy slept, while his fellow commoners dreamed of passing grades and noble approval, while the professors retired to their comfortable quarters with glasses of wine and stacks of ungraded papers, Alan trained. He had found the place during his second week, a forgotten storage room in the oldest part of the academy's lower level. The door was half hidden behind a collapsed bookshelf, and the lock, ancient and rusted, yielded easily to a simple spell that no first year should have known. Inside, he had discovered a space roughly 20 feet square, filled with broken furniture and crumbling texts, lit only by a single high window that let in the moonlight. It was perfect. Every night, when the dormitory fell silent and his roommates' breathing deepened into the rhythm of sleep, Alan slipped out of bed and made his way here. He had repaired the lock from the inside, added a few subtle wards that would alert him to any approach, and cleared the space for training. Now, in the silver light of a gibbous moon, he moved through forms that hadn't been seen in this era for centuries. His body was the problem. That was the irony of his situation. He had the knowledge, the experience, the instincts of a demon lord who had fought a decades-long war, but he was trapped in the body of a 16-year-old who had spent most of his life malnourished and untrained. His mana channels were underdeveloped, his muscles weak, his reflexes slowed by the limitations of youth. So he trained. He practiced the sword forms first, the ones that built speed and precision without requiring the strength he hadn't yet developed. The blade of falling leaves, a technique from the Eastern kingdoms that emphasized flow over force. The 7 serpent strikes, a style designed to disable opponents twice your size. The phantom step, a footwork pattern that made you impossible to predict. His wooden practice sword whispered through the air, each movement precise, each transition smooth. In the darkness, with only moonlight to guide him, he looked like a ghost performing a ritual from a forgotten age. When his muscles burned and his breath came in ragged gasps, he switched to meditation. He sat cross-legged on the cold stone floor and turned his attention inward, to the mana channels that carried his power through his body. In his past life, they had been like rivers, broad, deep, capable of carrying enormous amounts of energy. Now they were streams, narrow and blocked. He worked on expanding them, on clearing the obstructions, on strengthening the walls so they could eventually contain the power he would need. It was slow work, frustrating work, but Alan had learned patience in the crucible of war. He knew that haste led to mistakes, and mistakes led to death. He also knew he wasn't the only one training in secret. Through the walls, faint but unmistakable, he could sometimes feel the pulse of mana being shaped and molded. Someone else was practicing forbidden arts in the depths of the academy, someone with power that rivaled his own. He hadn't investigated yet. He wasn't ready, but he filed the information away, adding it to the mental map he was building of this timeline, this world, this second chance. The weeks passed in a rhythm of daylight deception and midnight training. By day, Alan was the unremarkable commoner, friendly, competent, but utterly forgettable. He answered questions in class with careful mediocrity, never revealing the depths of his knowledge. He practiced basic spells with his classmates, deliberately fumbling just enough to seem average. He ate in the commoners' section of the dining hall, laughed at jokes that weren't funny, and generally made himself invisible to anyone who might pose a threat. By night, he became something else. And slowly, painfully, his body began to catch up to his mind. The confrontation with Cedric had bought them a measure of peace. The blonde noble had kept his distance since that humiliating defeat, though Alan could feel his hatred burning from across crowded room. His friends had backed off as well, uncertain how to deal with a commoner who had so thoroughly humiliated their leader. The whispers continued, but they were quieter now, more cautious. Seraphina, for her part, had begun to change. It was subtle at first, a straighter spine when she walked through the halls, a steadier voice when answering professors' questions, a willingness to meet the eyes of those who sneered at her. Alan watched the transformation with quiet satisfaction. The spark he had seen on the first day was growing into a flame, but it was what happened at night that truly astonished him. He had known, of course, about her potential. He had seen her become the Saintess in his past life, had watched her wield power that could level mountains and heal the dying. But seeing that potential awaken in real time, watching her discover herself, was something else entirely. She came to him on a night 3 weeks after the Cedric incident, her eyes wide with wonder and fear. "Alan," she whispered, pulling him aside after dinner, "something's happening to me, something strange." He led her to a secluded corner of the library, away from prying ears. "Tell me." She held out her hand, and fire bloomed in her palm. But it wasn't ordinary fire. It was white-hot, almost blinding, and it gave off no heat. Light fire, solar flame, the purest form of magical energy in existence. "I didn't mean to," she said, her voice trembling. I was thinking about what you said, about not letting them break me, and I got so angry at all of them for treating us like we're nothing, and then this just happened." Alan stared at the flame, his mind racing. This was too soon. In his past life, her powers hadn't manifested until years later, after extensive training by the church. The fact that they were emerging now, spontaneously, was both a gift and a danger. "Can you control it?" he asked. She shook her head. "It comes and goes. Sometimes I can make it appear, but I can't always make it go away. Last night I couldn't sleep because my whole room was glowing, and I was afraid someone would see." Alan reached out and took her hand, the one holding the flame. The light didn't burn him. It recognized him, somehow accepted his touch. Seraphina gasped. "How did you do that? No one else can touch it. I tried with a book and it caught fire instantly." He released her hand, his expression thoughtful. "Your power is responding to emotion. Anger, fear, excitement, they trigger it. You need to learn to control those emotions, to channel them instead of being controlled by them." He paused, considering. "I can teach you, but it won't be easy and it has to stay secret. If the wrong people find out what you can do." "I know." Her voice was steady now, steadier than he expected. "They'll use me, or they'll try to destroy me. I'm not naive, Alan. I've seen how this world works. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw something he hadn't seen before. Strength, real strength beneath the fear and the uncertainty. The Saintess wasn't just a title she would earn. It was who she was, who she had always been, waiting to emerge. Tomorrow night, he said, meet me at the old storage room on the lower level, the one behind the collapsed bookshelf. Come after midnight when everyone's asleep. I'll teach you what I know. She nodded and the flame in her hand flickered and died. Alan. Yes, thank you for everything, for seeing me when no one else does. He wanted to tell her that he saw her because he had lost her, that every moment with her was a gift he hadn't earned and didn't deserve, that he would burn the world to keep her safe this time. But he couldn't, not yet. Get some rest, he said instead. Tomorrow night your real education begins. She smiled, a real smile, and slipped away into the shadows of the library. Alan watched her go, and for the first time since his regression, he allowed himself to feel something other than grim determination. He felt hope. The training sessions became their secret rhythm. Every night when the academy slept, they met in the forgotten storage room. Alan taught Seraphina to control her flame, to shape it, to understand its nature. He taught her meditation techniques from the Eastern Kingdom, breathing exercises from the desert nomad, focusing rituals from the mountain monastery. He drew on knowledge accumulated over 2 decades of war and conquest, knowledge that no first-year student should possess. She learned with terrifying speed. Within a month she could summon and dismiss her flame at will. Within 2 months she could shape it into forms, birds, flowers, words of power. Within 3, she could use it to enhance her other magic, her water spells boiling with light fire, her wind spells carrying the warmth of the sun. Alan watched her grow, and his heart both swelled and ached. She was becoming what he remembered, what he had lost, but she was also becoming something new, something shaped by his presence, by his protection, by his love. He hadn't intended to fall in love with her again. He had intended to protect her, to save her, to give her the life she deserved. But love, he was learning, didn't care about intention. It grew in the spaces between moments, in the quiet hours of training, in the smiles she gave him when she mastered a new technique, in the way she looked at him like he was something precious. He couldn't let himself feel it, not fully, not when the danger was still so present, when the future he remembered was still waiting to unfold. Love made you vulnerable. Love made you careless. Love had gotten him killed in a way, or at least had made him willing to die. But as winter settled over the academy, as the first snows fell and the world turned white and silent, Alan found himself caring less and less about the danger. And then everything changed. It happened during a practical examination, the kind that happened once a semester to assess student progress. The first years were gathered in the main training hall, a vast space with enchanted ceilings that could simulate any environment. Today, they would be tested on combat magic, pairs of students facing off in controlled duels while professors observed and graded. Alan had been paired with a minor noble, a girl with water affinity and nothing remarkable about her. He planned to lose barely, in a way that made him look competent but unexceptional. It was the same strategy he had used all semester, the strategy that had kept him invisible. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. Halfway through the examination, when Alan was preparing for his deliberately mediocre performance, the doors to the training hall burst open. A man strode in, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. He was old, ancient even, with a beard that reached his chest and robes so dark they seemed to absorb light. His eyes, pale blue and sharp as ice, swept across the assembled students with the casual interest of a predator surveying prey. Behind him, 2 attendants in the gray robes of academy administrators hurried to keep pace. Professor Aldric. Alan's blood turned to ice. He knew this man. Everyone knew this man. He was the Archmage of the Western Tower, one of the most powerful magic users in the kingdom, a living legend who had supposedly trained 3 generations of the realm's greatest mages. In the academy, he was treated with reverence, his rare appearances treated as holy events. In Alan's past life, Aldric had been the first to betray humanity. When the war came, when the kingdoms needed every mage they could muster, Aldric had sold them all for the promise of immortality. He had opened the gates of the capital to the enemy. He had personally executed a dozen of the realm's finest generals. He had laughed as cities burned, as children died, as everything Alan had fought to protect crumbled into ash. And now he was here in this training hall, his cold eyes scanning the student, looking for fresh meat. Alan forced himself to breathe, to calm his racing heart, to maintain the mask of an unremarkable commoner. He couldn't react, couldn't show recognition, couldn't give any sign that he knew what this man truly was. Aldric's gaze swept past him, lingered for a moment on Seraphina, of course. He would sense her power, even suppressed as it was, and then moved on. The Archmage spoke briefly with the head examiner, his voice too low to hear, and then took a seat in the observers section, his attendants flanking him like guards. The examinations continued. Alan fought his duel. He lost barely, in exactly the way he had planned. His opponent looked pleased. The professors made notes. No one paid him any special attention, but he felt those pale blue eyes on him throughout, watching, calculating, and he knew, with the certainty of experience, that his invisibility had just ended. That night the training session with Seraphina was different. Alan was distracted, his mind churning with possibilities and threats. He taught mechanically, his heart not in it, and eventually Seraphina stopped him. "What's wrong?" He looked at her, at this girl who had come to know him better than anyone in either of his lives. The Archmage, Aldric, he was watching us today. She frowned. "He watches everyone. He's famous for scouting talent." "It's not the same." Alan struggled to find words that wouldn't reveal too much. "There's something wrong with him, something dangerous. I can feel it." Seraphina studied him for a long moment. "You know something about him, something you're not telling me." It wasn't a question. Alan was silent for a long moment, wrestling with himself. He had promised himself he wouldn't tell her, not yet, not until she was ready. But looking at her now, seeing the strength in her eyes, the determination, the absolute trust, he wondered if he had been wrong to wait. "There are things I can't explain," he said finally. "Not yet, but I need you to trust me when I say that Aldric is not what he appears. He's dangerous, Seraphina. More dangerous than Cedric, more dangerous than any noble or professor in this academy. And if he takes an interest in you, he won't." Her voice was firm. "I'll be careful. I'll hide my power just like you taught me. It might not be enough. Then we'll deal with it when it's not enough." She stepped closer, taking his hands in hers. "Alan, I don't know what secrets you're carrying. I don't know why you came into my life like some kind of guardian angel, or why you know things you shouldn't, or why you look at me sometimes like you've already lost me and can't bear to lose me again. But I know this. I trust you, with my life, with everything." He stared at her, his heart cracking open in ways he hadn't thought possible. "You should be careful who you trust," he whispered. "I am careful." She squeezed his hands. "I trust you." And in that moment, in the dim light of their secret training room, with the snow falling silently outside and the weight of 2 lifetimes pressing down on him, Alan made a decision. He wouldn't tell her everything, not yet, but he would stop hiding, stop pretending to be less than he was, stop treating her like someone who needed to be protected from the truth. She was stronger than that. She had always been stronger than that. "Then let's get back to work," he said, and for the first time in weeks, his smile reached his eyes. "We have a lot to do before Aldric decides to make his move." She nodded, and the white flame flickered to life in her palm, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the academy in silence and cold. And somewhere in the darkness, ancient eyes watched and waited, patient as death itself. The invitation arrived 3 days later. It came in the form of a sealed letter, the parchment so fine it was almost translucent, the wax bearing the sigil of the Western Tower, a crescent moon embracing a burning star. A servant in gray livery delivered it to Alan's dormitory at dawn, handing it over with the kind of reverent care usually reserved for holy relics. Alan stared at the letter for a long moment after the servant departed. His roommate, a plump merchant's son named Theo, who spent most of his time either eating or complaining about the food, watched with wide eyes. "Is that from the Archmage, the actual Archmage?" Theo's voice was hushed with awe. "Alan, how do you know the Archmage?" "I don't," Alan said flatly. "He was at the practical examinations. That's the only contact I've had." Theo didn't look convinced, but he also didn't look inclined to press. The presence of the Archmage seal was enough to create a barrier between them, a reminder that Alan was no longer just another commoner. Alan waited until Theo had shuffled off to breakfast before breaking the seal. The letter inside was brief, the handwriting elegant and precise. Alan of no family name. Your performance in the practical examinations caught my attention. There is a quality to your magical signature that intrigues me, a depth, a complexity that your deliberately restrained showing could not fully conceive. I would speak with. Come to the Western Tower at sunset, alone. Archmage Aldric. Alan read the letter 3 times, memorizing every word, every nuance. Then he held it over his training candle and watched it burn. Aldric had noticed him, just as he had feared. The Archmage's senses were sharp enough to pierce the veil of mediocrity Alan had so carefully constructed. And now he was being summoned, like a subject to a king, to be examined and evaluated. He thought about refusing. He thought about pleading illness, about disappearing into the bowels of the academy until the Archmage's interest faded, but he knew that would only make things worse. Aldric was not a man who accepted refusal gracefully. In his past life, he had destroyed entire families for slights far smaller than ignoring a summon. No, he would go. He would play the role of the awestruck commoner, flattered by attention from so great a figure. He would answer questions with careful ignorance, reveal nothing of his true capabilities, and hope that Aldric's interest would wane. It was a terrible plan. It was the only plan he had. He found Seraphina between classes, pulling her aside into an empty classroom. Her face paled as he summarized the letter. "This is bad," she whispered. "Very bad. What are you going to do? Go, listen. Pretend to be exactly what I've always pretended to be." He gripped her shoulders, meeting her eyes. "If I'm not back by midnight, you need to run. Leave the academy, leave the capital, go somewhere far away and hide your power so deep no one can find it. Promise me." "Alan, promise me, Seraphina." She swallowed hard, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I promise, but you'll come back, you have to come back." He wanted to promise her that too, but he had learned in 20 years of war that promises about the future were lies waiting to happen. So instead, he pulled her close, holding her against his chest for just a moment, feeling her heartbeat against his own. "I'll do everything I can," he murmured into her hair. Then he let her go and walked away. The Western Tower stood apart from the rest of the academy, a spire of black stone that seemed to drink the light from the sky around it. It was ancient, older than the kingdom itself, built by mages whose names had been forgotten centuries ago. Legends said it had once been a prison for a king. Looking at it now, in the blood-red light of sunset, Alan could almost believe. He climbed the spiral staircase alone, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The wards here were thick enough to taste, layers upon layers of protective magic that would reduce any intruder to ash in seconds. Alan recognized some of them from his past life, knew the counters for others, but he walked through them like the ignorant commoner he was pretending to be, trusting that Aldric's invitation would keep him safe. The Archmage's study occupied the entire top floor of the tower. It was a circular room lined with bookshelves that stretched to a ceiling lost in shadow. Tables held artifacts that would have made the Academy's treasure master weep with envy, crystals that pulsed with inner light, blades that hummed with enchantment, scrolls written in languages that predated human speech. In the center of it all, seated in a chair that looked more like a throne, was Aldric. He looked different up close. Older, certainly, but also younger in a way that was deeply unsettling. His eyes held the weight of centuries, but his movements were those of a man in his prime. Power radiated from him like heat from a forge, invisible but unmistakable. "Alan," he said, and his voice was surprisingly gentle. "Thank you for coming, please sit." A chair materialized across from him, pulling itself from the shadow. Alan sat, keeping his expression carefully neutral. "You're wondering why I called you." Aldrich smiled, and it almost reached his eyes. "I imagine you're also wondering if you're in trouble. You're not. Quite the opposite, in fact." "Then why, Archmage?" Alan asked, pitching his voice to carry just the right amount of nervous respect. "I'm nobody, a commoner with average grades and no family name. I don't understand what someone like you could possibly want with me." Aldrich laughed, a genuine sound that filled the room. "Oh, I like you already. No false modesty, no groveling, just honest confusion." He leaned forward and his eyes sharpened. "But you're wrong about one thing, Alan. You're not average. Your magical signature tells a different story entirely." Alan's heart stuttered, but he kept his face blank. "I don't understand." Of course you don't, that's why I'm explaining. Aldric rose from his chair and began to pace, his robes trailing behind him like wings of shadow. Every mage has a signature, a unique pattern of mana that identifies them as surely as a fingerprint. Most signatures are simple, easily read. Yours is complex, layered. It's as if there are multiple magical presences within you, all resonating together. I've only seen such signatures twice before in my long life, and both times they belonged to mages who went on to reshape the world. He turned, fixing Alan with those ancient eyes. You have potential, boy. Not the kind that gets you good grades and a comfortable position in some noble's household. Real potential. The kind that changes history. Alan forced himself to look awed, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. I just try to do my best in classes I never thought. Of course you didn't. That's why it's so precious. Aldric returned to his chair, his expression turning thoughtful. I want to offer you something, Alan. Something I've only offered 3 times in the past century. I want to take you as my personal student. The words hit Alan like a physical blow. Personal student to the Archmage. In his past life, that offer had never come. He had been too ambitious, too hungry, too desperate to prove himself. The Aldric of that timeline had seen him as a threat, not a potential asset. But now, by hiding his true nature, by playing the humble commoner, he had made himself attractive. The irony was almost too much. I'm honored, Alan said, and meant it in a way Aldric couldn't possibly understand. Truly I am, but I don't understand why me. There are nobles with better grades, better family connections, better everything. Why choose a nobody like me? Aldric's smile widened, and for just a moment, Alan saw something beneath it, something cold and hungry and utterly inhuman. Because the nobles are already shaped, the Archmage said. They come to me with their prejudices and their ambitions, their family traditions and their political alliances. They're already half-formed, already committed to paths they can't escape. But you, he gestured, and Alan felt a thread of magic brush against his consciousness, probing, testing. You're still clay, still waiting to be molded. With the right guidance, with the right teaching, you could become anything. A tool. He was offering to make Alan into a tool, just as he had done with so many others in the past life, molding them into weapons for his own purposes before casting them aside when the war came. Alan kept his expression awed, grateful, but inside, cold fury was building. I don't know what to say, he managed. It's more than I ever dreamed of. Then say yes. Aldric's voice was soft, persuasive. Say yes, and I will open doors for you that you didn't know existed. I will teach you magic that isn't in any textbook, secrets that have been lost for millennia. You will leave this academy as something more than a commoner with potential. You will leave as my heir. Your puppet, Alan thought. Your sacrifice when the time comes. But aloud, he said, may I have some time to think about it? It's a lot to process. I need to. Of course. Aldric waved a hand, magnanimous. Take a week. Consider the offer carefully. But Alan, his eyes hardened just slightly. This is not the kind of opportunity that comes twice. And I am not the kind of man who enjoys being The threat was subtle, buried beneath layers of courtesy. But Alan heard it clearly. Refuse me, and you become my enemy. He rose, bowing with the awkward grace of someone unused to formal courtesy. Thank you, Archmage, for everything. I'll give your offer the consideration it deserves. Aldric nodded, already turning away, dismissing him. The servant will see you out. Until next week, Alan. I look forward to your answer. Alan walked out of the tower on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The night air hit him like a wave, cold and clean after the oppressive atmosphere of the Archmage's study. He made it halfway across the courtyard before his legs gave out, and he sank onto a stone bench, his whole body trembling. He had just stared into the face of his enemy and smiled. He had just been offered everything he had once wanted, everything that would have made his past life so much easier, and he had just realized with absolute certainty that refusing would mark him for death. Alan, Seraphina's voice. He looked up, and there she was, wrapped in a cloak against the cold, her face pale with worry. You're alive, she breathed, sinking onto the bench beside him. I was so scared. When the sun set and you didn't come back, I thought. I'm fine. The words came out automatically. I'm fine, he made me an offer. What kind of offer? Alan looked at her, at this girl who had become the center of his second life, and made a decision. He wants me to be his personal student. His heir, he called it. He laughed, and there was no humor in it. The most powerful mage in the kingdom wants to take a nobody commoner and make him into something great. Seraphina's eyes widened. Alan, that's incredible. Why do you look like someone just told you the world is ending? Because I know what he really is. Because I've seen the future he creates. Because accepting his offer means walking into the lion's den with my eyes open, and refusing means painting a target on both our backs. But he couldn't say any of that, not yet. Because nothing in this world is free, he said instead, especially not from men like him. If he's offering this much, he wants something in return, something I'm not sure I'm willing to give. Seraphina was silent for a long moment, studying his face in the dim light of the courtyard lamps. Then she took his hand, her fingers cold but steady. Then don't give it, we'll find another way. We always do. He looked at her, at the absolute faith in her eyes, and felt something loosen in his chest. She believed in him, not because she knew his secrets, but because of who he had shown himself to be. The boy who stood up to bullies, the friend who trained with her in secret, the person who looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. He couldn't tell her everything, but he could tell her this. He's not what he seems, Seraphina. Aldric. There's something wrong with him, something dark. I can feel it. And if I accept his offer, I'll be walking into his web. If I refuse, he trailed off. He'll see you as a threat. Her voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. Someone who knows too much, who has too much potential, who might one day challenge him. Alan nodded. Then we have a week to figure out what to do. She squeezed his hand. And we're not alone. You've been building something here, Alan. I've seen it. The outcasts you talk to, the future monsters you're so interested in. They trust you. They'll help. He stared at her, surprised. He hadn't realized she had noticed his recruitment efforts, his careful cultivation of the students who would one day become legend. The future spy master, a quiet boy named Ren who never spoke but saw everything. The banished genius healer Myra, whose family had cast her out for a crime she didn't commit. The brooding berserker Kale, whose rage issues made him a pariah but whose potential was terrifying. They were scattered across the academy, each of them alone, each of them waiting for something they couldn't name. And Alan had been quietly, carefully drawing them together. You've been watching me, he said. I've been paying attention, she smiled a little sadly. It's what I do. It's how I survived before you came along. I watch and I learn and I wait. And I've learned that you're building something. An army maybe, or a family, I'm not sure which. Both, Alan said quietly. Hopefully both. Then let's build it together. She stood, pulling him to his feet. 1 week, Alan. We have 1 week to prepare for whatever comes next. Let's not waste it. They walked back toward the dormitories through the sleeping academy, their hands still linked, their breath misting in the cold air. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the dramas playing out below. But in the darkness of the western tower, ancient eyes watched them go, and a smile curved lips that had forgotten how to feel warmth. Interesting, Aldric thought. Very interesting. The boy has attachments, weaknesses, things to protect, and things to threaten. He turned back to his artifacts, his plans, his centuries of accumulated power. The boy would accept. They always did in the end. And if he didn't, well, there were other ways to mold clay. The week passed in a blur of activity. Alan trained harder than ever, pushing his body to its limits, expanding his mana channels with techniques that bordered on danger. Seraphina trained beside him, her solar flame growing brighter, more controlled, more deadly. And in the spaces between training, they talked. Not about the past. Alan still couldn't bring himself to share that, but about the future, about what they wanted to build, who they wanted to become, how they wanted to change the world. And slowly, carefully, Alan began to introduce her to his recruits. Ren was first. The future spy master was a thin, pale boy with watchful eyes and a talent for being invisible. He had been beaten by nobles twice in his first month, his silence mistaken for weakness. Alan had found him bleeding in a stairwell and had simply sat with him until he was ready to move. No question, no pity, just present. Now Ren followed Alan like a shadow, his eyes cataloging everything, his mind building maps of alliances and enmities that would have taken most people years to assemble. He's watching us, Ren said quietly, the first time Alan brought Seraphina to their secret meeting. The Archmage, he has eyes everywhere, servants, students, even some professors. Can you find them? Alan asked. Identify them. Ren nodded once, sharp and certain. Give me time. Time was exactly what they didn't have. Myra came next. The banished healer was older than the rest of them, 19 to their 16, held back by the trauma of her family's rejection. She had healing magic that could mend broken bones in seconds, but she rarely used it, terrified of drawing attention. Alan had found her in the library, crying over a book she couldn't afford to buy, and had simply handed her the coin. Now she looked at Seraphina with something like wonder. Your flame, she breathed the first time she saw it. It's not just light, it's life. I can feel it from here. Seraphina glanced at Alan, who nodded slightly. Can you do something with it? She asked Myra. Can you use it? Myra reached out a trembling hand, and when her fingers touched the white flame, it didn't burn. Instead, it flowed into her, and for just a moment her eyes glowed with solar light. I think, she whispered, I think I can learn. And finally Kale. The berserker was the hardest. He was huge for his age, already taller than most adults, with arms like tree trunks and a perpetual scowl. His rage issues had gotten him expelled from 3 training academies before this one, and he was widely expected to wash out within the year. Alan had found him after a particularly violent outburst, sitting in the aftermath of destruction, his hands covered in blood that wasn't his own. You're not a monster, Alan had told him. You're just angry, and anger can be a weapon if you learn to aim it. Kale had looked at him with eyes that held nothing but despair. You don't know what I am. I know exactly what you are, Alan had replied, and I know what you could become, if you're willing to trust me. It had taken months, but slowly, painfully, Kale had begun to trust. He still struggled, still fought his own nature every day, but he came to the secret meeting. He listened, and when he looked at Seraphina, at her gentle smile and steady presence, something in his eyes softened. You're different, he told her once, blunt as always. You look at me like I'm a person, not a problem. You are a person, Seraphina said simply. A person who's been hurt, a person who's trying. That's all any of us are. Kale had no response to that, but he started showing up earlier to their meeting and staying later, and once, just once, Alan thought he saw the ghost of a smile on that fearsome face. By the end of the week, they had become something. Not quite a team. That would take time, trust, shared trials, but a beginning, a foundation. The first stones of a fortress that might, if they were lucky and brave and skilled enough, withstand the storm that was coming. On the 6th night, Alan gathered them all in the secret training room. Seraphina stood at his side, her flame casting dancing shadows across their faces. Ren lurked near the door, ever watchful. Myra sat cross-legged on the floor, her healing hands folded in her lap. Kale leaned against the wall, arms crossed, pretending he wasn't invested. Tomorrow, Alan said quietly, I have to give the Archmage my answer. No one spoke. They all knew what was at stake. I'm going to refuse him. Seraphina's hand found his, squeezing tight. Ren's eyes widened slightly, the most expression he ever showed. Myra bit her lip. Kale straightened, his scowl deepening. He won't take that well, the berserker rumbled. No, he won't. Alan met each of their eyes in turn, which means we need to be ready, ready for surveillance, ready for sabotage, ready for open attack if it comes to that. I won't lie to you, this is dangerous. If you want to walk away, I'll understand. No judgment, no hard feeling. Ren was the first to speak. I'm already his enemy, I just didn't know it until now. He shrugged, a strangely elegant gesture. Might as well make it official. Myra rose, crossing to stand beside Seraphina. You gave me hope when I had none. I'm not walking away from that. Kale pushed off from the wall, his massive form looming in the dim light. I've spent my whole life being told I'm a monster. You're the first person who ever showed me that monsters can choose what they become. He cracked his knuckle, a sound like breaking bone. Let the Archmage come. I'll show him what a real monster looks like. Alan looked at them, these broken, beautiful, impossible people, and felt something he hadn't felt in 20 years. He felt like he belonged. Then tomorrow, he said, we change the world. The next evening, Alan climbed the western tower alone. The sunset was blood-red, painting the sky in shades of violence and warning. The wards parted for him as before, recognizing the Archmage's invitation. The spiral staircase seemed longer this time, each step heavier than the last. Aldric was waiting in the same chair, in the same position, as if he hadn't moved in the intervening week. His ancient eyes tracked Alan's approach with the patience of a predator. You've made your decision, he said. It wasn't a question. Alan stopped before him, standing straight, meeting those eyes without flinching. I have. And, for just a moment, Alan let the mask slip. Let Aldric see something of what lay beneath. The cold fury, the ancient grief, the absolute certainty of someone who had already lived through this and knew how it ended. I refuse. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the ever-present hum of the tower's magic seemed to pause, holding its breath. Aldric's expression didn't change, but his eyes grew colder, darker, deeper than any ocean. Explain yourself. Alan didn't bow, didn't look away. You're not offering me an education, Archmage. You're offering me a cage. You want to mold me, shape me, make me into a tool for your purposes. I've spent my whole life being told what to do, being pushed and pulled by people who thought they knew better. I'm done with that. Bold words from a commoner boy with no power and no protection. Aldric's voice was silk wrapped around steel. Do you have any idea what I could do to you? What I could do to your little friend? The girl with the solar flame, the healer, the berserker, the shadow boy who thinks he's invisible. I know about them, Alan. I know everything. Alan's heart clenched, but he kept his face calm. Then you know they'll fight. You know they'll die before they let you use them. And you know that if you touch them, if you hurt any of them, I will spend the rest of my life making regret it. Aldric laughed. It was a terrible sound, empty of humor, empty of warmth. You, he said, a child with delusions of grandeur. You think you can threaten me. I'm not threatening. Alan stepped forward, and for just a moment the full weight of his past life pressed against the walls of his control. I'm making you a promise. Leave us alone. Leave all of us alone. And when the war comes, and it will come, Archmage, you know it as well as I do, we won't be on the opposite side. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Aldric studied him for a long, terrible moment. Then slowly he smiled. Interesting, he murmured. Very interesting. You know something, boy, something you shouldn't. Something about the future, perhaps. He tilted his head, and his eyes gleamed with something that might have been hunger. I wonder how that could be. I wonder what secrets you're hiding. He rose from his chair, and suddenly the tower seemed to contract, the walls pressing closer, the shadows deepening. But secrets can be uncovered, walls can be breached, and children who think they can defy their betters. He stepped forward, and Alan felt the weight of his power pressing down, crushing, suffocating. They learn, one way or another. Alan stood his ground, though every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to do something. He had faced this man before in the final battles of the war. He had seen him fall. He knew he could be beaten. But not yet, not here, not like this. I'll be watching you, Aldric whispered. All of you. And when you stumble, when you fall, when you make a mistake, and you will, boy, you will, I'll be there, waiting. The pressure vanished. Alan stumbled, catching himself on a nearby table. When he looked up, Aldric was back in his chair, his expression serene, as if nothing had happened. You may go, the Archmage said. We have nothing more to discuss. Alan didn't run. He walked, steady and controlled, all the way down the spiral staircase, across the courtyard, through the academy gates. Only when he reached the secret training room, when he saw Seraphina's face, when her arms wrapped around him and held him tight, only then did he let himself shake. He knows, he whispered into her hair. He knows about all of you. He's going to watch us, wait for us to make a mistake. Seraphina held him tighter. Then we won't make mistakes. Behind them, in the shadows of the room, Ren, Myra, and Kale stood silent and waiting, ready to fight, ready to die, ready to follow this impossible boy who had given them hope. Outside, the last light of sunset faded into night, and somewhere in the darkness, ancient eyes watched and waited, patient as death itself. The game had begun. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in sustained pressure. Aldric didn't attack directly. That would have been too crude, too obvious, too easily traced back to the Western Tower. Instead, he did something far more insidious. He simply turned the full weight of his attention upon them and watched as the academy itself became their enemy. It started small. Alan's assignments, once graded fairly, began coming back with red ink slashing through correct answers, points deducted for lack of clarity on problems he had solved perfectly, comments questioning his reasoning, his methodology, his very understanding of magical theory. His grades, carefully maintained at an unremarkable level, began to slip. Seraphina faced worse. Her practical exercises, once praised by instructors who saw her potential, were now criticized with increasing harshness. Her control was sloppy, her form was unconventional, her mana usage was inefficient. The professors who had once smiled at her now looked through her as if she didn't exist. Ren found his access to the library restricted. The quiet boy who lived for knowledge was suddenly barred from the advanced sections, his requests for texts denied with bureaucratic excuses. Myra's healing services, once sought after by students who couldn't afford the infirmary, were now dismissed as unlicensed practice. Kale was watched constantly, followed by proctors who seemed to appear whenever he was alone, waiting for him to lose control. It was death by 1,000 cuts. Nothing they could point to, nothing they could protest, nothing that would draw attention to the hand behind it all. Just the slow, steady grinding down of their lives, their hopes, their futures. Alan gathered them in the secret room on a night when the pressure had become almost unbearable. They sat in a circle, the white flame of Seraphina's power casting long shadows across their faces. "He's trying to break us," Alan said quietly. "Not kill us. That would be too obvious too soon. He wants us to break on our own, to give up, to run, to make the mistake he's waiting for." Myra hugged her knees to her chest, her face drawn and tired. "It's working. I can feel it working. Every day it gets harder to get out of bed, harder to believe this will ever get better." Kale's massive hands clenched into fists. "I want to hit something, someone, him." His voice was a rumble of barely contained fury. "Give me the word, Alan. I'll go to that tower and die," Ren interrupted, his quiet voice cutting through Kale's rage. "You'd be dead before you reached the first landing. We all would be. That's what he wants, for us to do something stupid, something that justifies destroying us. So what do we do?" Seraphina's voice was steady, but Alan could see the strain in her eyes. "We can't fight him directly. We can't outlast him. He's centuries old. He can wait forever. We're trapped." Alan looked at each of them in turn. His family, his hope, his reason for fighting. "We changed the game," he said. They stared at him. "What does that mean?" Myra asked. Alan rose, moving to the wall where he had scratched a crude map of the academy and its surrounding. He traced a line from the western tower to the main campus. "Aldric's power here is absolute because no one challenges. The professors fear him. The administration answers to him. The students worship him. He's been building this control for centuries, layering influence upon influence until no one even thinks to question." He turned to face them. "But that kind of power has a weakness. It depends on people believing it's unassailable. The moment someone proves it can be challenged, the moment cracks appear in the facade, the whole thing crumbles," Ren finished, his eyes lighting with understanding. "But how? How do we challenge someone like him without getting crushed?" Alan smiled, and there was something in that smile that made even Kale shiver. "We don't challenge him directly. We challenge everything around him. We build our own power base, our own influence, our own network. We become too valuable to destroy, too visible to ignore, too connected to isolate." He looked at Seraphina. "You asked what we're building, an army or a family. It's both, and it's time to start building in the open." The plan they crafted that night was audacious, dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was also the only chance they had. The first step was the smallest. Ren, with his network of invisible observers, began spreading rumors. Not about Aldric, that would have been too obvious. Instead, he spread rumors about the other nobles, the other power players, the other factions within the academy. Whispers of affairs, of financial troubles, of political maneuvering. Nothing that could be traced back to them. Nothing that couldn't be denied. Just enough chaos to distract, to divide, to keep the predators looking at each other instead of at the prey gathering in the shadow. The second step was bolder. Myra, with her healing magic, began offering her services openly, not just to commoners but to anyone who needed help. A noble's favorite horse, injured in a fall. A professor's chronic pain, eased with gentle hand. A servant's sick child, saved from fear. She asked nothing in return, but she remembered every face, every name, every debt of gratitude. Within a month she had more allies than she could count. People who owed her. People who would speak for her. People who would remember when the time came. The third step was the most dangerous. Kale, the berserker who had spent his whole life hiding his rage, began to channel it. He joined the combat clubs, the fighting circles where nobles and commoners alike tested their skills. At first, they laughed at him. The big oaf with no technique, no training, no control. But Kale had been trained by Alan, and Alan had fought beside the greatest berserkers in the world. He taught Kale to aim his rage, to focus it, to use it like a blade instead of a club. Within a month, Kale was undefeated. Within 2, he was legendary. Students whispered about the mad dog of the academy, the commoner who could tear through any opponent with terrifying strength and impossible skill. Nobles who had once mocked him now sought his favor, hopping to recruit him to their houses. He refused them all, but he remembered their faces, their offers, their desperation. And when the time came, he would call in those debts. And through it all, Seraphina grew. Her solar flame, once a secret terror, became something else under Alan's guidance. She learned to weave it into her speech, her presence, her very being. When she walked through the academy, people noticed. When she spoke, people listened. There was something about her now, something that drew the eye and warmed the heart. It was the same quality that would one day make her the Saintess, the ability to make people believe, to make people hope, to make people follow. She began speaking to the commoners, the outcasts, the forgotten. Not as a leader, not as a savior, but as one of them. She listened to their stories, their grievances, their dreams. She offered comfort where she could, advice where she dared, and hope where nothing else remained. And one by one, they started to believe. By the end of the first semester, something had shifted in the academy. The nobles still ruled, of course. The hierarchy still stood, but beneath it, in the spaces between, a new current was flowing. A current of commoners who had stopped bowing quite so low, of outcasts who had stopped apologizing for existing, of forgotten students who had started to remember that they, too, had power. Aldric noticed, of course. He noticed everything, but for the first time in centuries, he wasn't sure what to do about it. The second semester brought new challenges and new opportunities. The Academy Festival was the highlight of the academic year, a week of competition, exhibitions, and celebrations that drew visitors from across the kingdom. Nobles brought their family, merchants brought their wares. The king himself sometimes attended, watching from a special pavilion as the best and brightest of the next generation competed for glory. For Alan and his growing circle, it was both a threat and an opportunity. "He'll try something during the festival," Wren said at one of their nightly. The secret room was getting crowded now. Word had spread carefully, selectively, and a dozen commoners now gathered in the space that had once held only 4. Too many people, too much chaos. The perfect cover for an accident. Then we don't give him the chance. Alan looked around the room at the faces watching him. Young, desperate, hopeful. We enter the competitions, all of us. We show the kingdom what commoners can do. We make ourselves too visible to hide, too famous to quietly eliminate. Murmurs rippled through the group. Fear, excitement, doubt. "We'll be targeted," one boy said. "The nobles won't let commoners win. They'll cheat, sabotage, do whatever it takes." "Let them try." Kale's voice rumbled from the corner where he sat, his massive form somehow taking up less space than it should. "I've been dealing with that my whole life. At least this time I get to hit back." Laughter, nervous but real, spread through the room. Seraphina rose, and the white flame flickered to life in her palm, not as a weapon but as a light, as hope. "We're not doing this for glory," she said quietly. "We're not doing this to prove anything to the nobles or the professors or anyone else. We're doing this because it's our right, because we belong here as much as anyone, because if we don't stand up now, we'll spend the rest of our lives on our knees." She looked at Alan and he nodded. "Sign up," he said. "All of you, for whatever competition suit your skills, and when the festival begins, show them what we've become." The Academy Festival dawned bright and cold, winter's last gasp before the thaw of spring. The grounds had been transformed. Tents and pavilions sprouted like colorful mushrooms across every open space. Stalls sold food from distant lands, trinkets enchanted with minor magic, souvenirs to mark the occasion. The air hummed with excitement, with anticipation, with the electric charge of thousands of people gathered in one place. And at the center of it all, the competition ground. There were events for every skill: magical dueling, swordsmanship, archery, alchemy, runic crafting, even a theoretical debate competition for those whose strengths lay in knowledge rather than power. Nobles had been training for months, hearing private tutors, acquiring enchanted equipment, doing whatever it took to ensure victory. The commoners, for the most part, hadn't bothered. What was the point? They would lose anyway. The system was rigged. Everyone knew it. But this year was different. The first event was the magical dueling tournament. Single elimination, random brackets, a test of pure power and skill. 56 students entered, Most were nobles, their names heavy with history, their robes heavy with enchantment. One of them was Seraphina. Her first match was against a minor noble with water affinity and 3 years of private tutoring. He laughed when he saw her, a commoner girl in patched robes, her only visible magic a faint glow that could have been anything. He stopped laughing when her white flame consumed his water dragon in less than a second and gently deposited him outside the ring. The crowd went silent. Then someone cheered, a commoner somewhere in the back, then another, then a dozen. Seraphina smiled, and the white flame flickered in her palm like a promise. Her second match was harder. A fire mage with years of experience, his flames hot enough to melt stone. He attacked without mercy, filling the ring with fire, confident that no commoner could withstand him. Seraphina stood in the center of the inferno and absorbed it all. Her white flame drank his red, drawing strength from every attack, growing brighter, hotter, more intense. When he finally collapsed from exhaustion, his mana drained completely, she was still standing, still smiling, still untouched. The crowd erupted. By the third match, word had spread. People packed the stands, commoners and nobles alike, drawn by the legend of the girl who couldn't be burned. Her opponent was a noble from a powerful house, his lightning magic crackling with barely contained fury. He attacked with everything he had, lightning bolts striking from every angle, trying to overwhelm her through sheer volume. She caught them. One by one she caught them in her flame, and they dissolved into light. When she finally struck back, a single, gentle push of white fire that lifted him from his feet and set him down gently outside the ring. The crowd went absolutely insane. In the royal pavilion, the king leaned forward, his eyes sharp with interest. Beside him, a dozen nobles watched with expressions ranging from admiration to calculation to barely concealed fury. And in the shadows of the western tower, ancient eyes watched as well, watching, waiting, planning. The semifinals came the next day. Seraphina's opponent was Cedric. The blonde noble had recovered from his humiliation at Alan's hands, throwing himself into training with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He had improved dramatically, his fire magic now tinged with the purple of lightning affinity, his control sharpened by endless practice. He saw this match as redemption, as proof that he was still the best, still destined for greatness, still above the common rabble who dared to challenge him. "You," he spat when they met in the ring. "I should have known. You and that boyfriend of yours always causing trouble. Well, this time there's no one to save you. This time it's just you and me." Seraphina looked at him calmly. "I don't need anyone to save me." The match began. Cedric attacked with everything he had. Fire and lightning combined in devastating combination, techniques that would have defeated any other opponent in seconds. He had studied Seraphina's previous matches, analyzed her patterns, prepared counters for every move she had shown. But Seraphina had been trained by Alan, and Alan had taught her that the greatest weapon wasn't power, it was unpredictability. She fought differently this time. Instead of absorbing his attacks, she dodged. Instead of meeting force with force, she flowed around it. Her white flame manifested in new ways, whips that snapped at his flanks, shields that deflected his lightning, birds that dove at his face to distract and confuse. Cedric grew frustrated. His attacks became wilder, less controlled, more desperate. He was burning through his mana at an alarming rate, and Seraphina hadn't even broken a sweat. "Stand still," he screamed, launching a massive fireball that would have killed a lesser opponent. Seraphina didn't stand still. She stepped forward into the fireball and threw it. The white flame wrapped around her like a cloak, parting the inferno, leaving her untouched. And then she was before him, her hand raised, a single point of white light gathering at her fingertip. "Do you yield?" she asked quietly. Cedric stared at her, his face a mask of fury and despair. For a moment, Alan thought he would attack anyway, would force her to hurt him, to prove that he was still dangerous. But then something in his eyes broke. He sagged, his hands dropping to his sides. "I yield." The crowd erupted. Seraphina had done it, a commoner girl in the finals of the magical dueling tournament. It was unprecedented, impossible, and it was happening right now. In the stands, Alan watched with a mixture of pride and she had done exactly what he asked. She had made herself visible, undeniable, too famous to ignore. But visibility cut both ways. Everyone was watching now. Everyone had an opinion, and some of those opinions would be dangerous. The finals were the next day. Seraphina's opponent was a noble from the far north, a girl with ice magic so powerful she had frozen entire sections of the arena during her matches. She was tall, cold, utterly confident. Her name was Ilara, and she had never lost a match in her life. The crowd was split now. Half cheered for the noble, for tradition, for the natural order. Half cheered for the commoner, for the underdog, for the girl who had defied every expectation. Alan found Seraphina before the match, in a quiet corner away from the crowds. She was meditating, her flame burning low and steady. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "You've already proven everything you needed to prove." She opened her eyes and they were calm, peaceful, certain. "Yes, I do," she rose, taking his hand. "This isn't about proving anything anymore, Alan. This is about showing them, all of them, that we won't be hidden, that we won't be silenced, that we exist and we matter and we're not going away." He looked at her, at this girl who had been nothing when he found her, who had grown into something extraordinary, something that made his heart ache with love and fear and hope. "You're amazing," he whispered. She smiled. "I know. You told me once that you should have helped me before, that you regretted not doing it. Well, you're helping me now. That's what matters." The bells rang, calling them to the arena. They walked together toward the sound of the crowd, toward the match that would change everything, toward a future that was no longer certain but was, for the first time, full of possibility. And in the shadows, ancient eyes watched and waited. But for the first time in centuries, there was something new in those eyes. Doubt. The final match of the magical dueling tournament was unlike anything the Academy had ever witnessed. The arena was packed to overflowing. Students and professors and visitors crammed into every available space, spilling onto the surrounding lawns and climbing trees for a better view. Word had spread across the capital overnight. A commoner girl had reached the finals, a nobody, a charity case, and she was about to face the undefeated ice princess of the northern nobility. The king himself had returned to watch. His pavilion expanded to accommodate the nobles who had suddenly decided this was the most important event of the season. Merchants hawked commemorative scarves, one side blue for Ilara, one side white for Seraphina. Bets were being placed at ratios that would make a gambler weep, 10-1 in favor of the noble, despite everything Seraphina had already accomplished. Alan stood at the edge of the competitors' area, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt since his past life's final battle. Ren was beside him, his eyes scanning the crowd, cataloging threats. Myra had her healing hands ready, though what she could do against the kind of damage an ice mage of Ilara's caliber could inflict, Alan didn't know. Kale loomed behind them, his massive form radiating barely contained tension. "She's ready," Myra said quietly. "You trained her well." Alan nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Aldric had been too quiet during the festival, too absent. The Archmage hadn't appeared at any of the matches, hadn't made any public statements, hadn't done anything to interfere with Seraphina's unprecedented rise. It wasn't like him. In Alan's past life, Aldric had never let a potential threat develop without trying to control or eliminate it, which meant he was planning something big, something that would happen today during the final match when all eyes were on the arena. "I need you to watch," he told Ren quietly. "Not the match, the crowd, the professors, anyone who looks like they don't belong. If you see anything suspicious, I'll signal." Ren melted away into the crowd, invisible as always. The bells tolled and the crowd fell silent. Ilara entered the arena first, and the northern nobles in attendance erupted in cheer. She was striking, tall and pale, with ice-blue eyes and hair so white it seemed to shimmer with frost. Her robes were enchanted, that much was obvious. Frost formed on the ground wherever she stepped, and her breath misted in the air despite the spring warmth. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had been trained since birth for exactly this moment. Then Seraphina entered, and the commoners found their voice. The roar that went up was deafening. They cheered for her, this girl in her patched robes with her gentle smile and her impossible flame. They cheered for themselves, for every time they had been told they weren't good enough, didn't belong, should know their place. She was their hope made flesh, their dream given form. Seraphina walked to the center of the arena and faced her opponent. The white flame flickered to life in her palm, casting warm light across the frost forming at Ilara's feet. "The rules are simple," the head judge announced, his voice amplified by magic. The match continues until one competitor yields or is unable to continue. Lethal force is prohibited. Begin. For a long moment, neither girl moved. Alara studied Seraphina with cold, calculating eyes. "You've impressed me," she said quietly, for only the two of them to hear. "A commoner with your power. It's unprecedented. Join my house after this. I'll protect you from the vultures who'll try to use you." Seraphina smiled. "I already have people who protect me, and I protect them in return." Alara's eyes flickered with something that might have been respect. "Pity. I would have enjoyed having you as an ally." She raised her hands and the temperature in the arena plummeted. "Prepare yourself." The match exploded into motion. Alara attacked first, a wave of ice spikes erupting from the ground and racing towards Seraphina like frozen spears. Seraphina's white flame became a wall, melting the spikes before they could reach her, steam billowing into the air. But Alara was already moving, circling, attacking from every angle with relentless precision. Ice rained from above. The ground beneath Seraphina's feet turned to slick frost, trying to make her fall. The very air grew thick with cold, sapping her strength, stealing her warmth. Alara fought like the winter itself, patient, inevitable, absolutely certain of victory. But Seraphina had been trained by a demon lord. She moved through the storm of ice like a dancer, her white flame responding to her every thought. It became shields, blades, wings that carried her above the worst attacks. It melted the frost beneath her feet before it could take hold. It wrapped around her like a second skin, keeping her warm, keeping her strong. And through it all she watched, waited, learned. Alara's pattern became clear after the first few minutes. She was aggressive, yes, but her aggression followed a rhythm. Attack, reposition, assess, attack again. It was the rhythm of someone who had never faced an opponent who could truly challenge her, someone who had never had to adapt. Seraphina smiled. When the next attack came, a barrage of ice lances that would have impaled a lesser opponent, she didn't dodge. She stepped forward into the lances, and her white flame exploded outward in a ring of pure light. The lances didn't just melt, they sublimated, turning directly from ice to vapor, vanishing in an instant. The ring of light continued outward, forcing Alara to leap back, breaking her rhythm, disrupting her pattern. And then Seraphina was on her. The white flame became a blade in her hand, and she pressed the attack with a ferocity that shocked everyone watching. Strike after strike, each one forcing Alara to defend, to retreat, to give ground. The ice mage tried to counter, tried to summon her power, but Seraphina gave her no time, no space, no chance to regroup. In the stands, Alan watched with pride and wonder. She had learned faster than he ever could have hoped. She was fighting like someone with decades of experience, not months of training. But even as he watched, a flicker of movement in the royal pavilion caught his eye. Aldric, the Archmage, had arrived, slipping into the pavilion with the quiet grace of a predator. He wasn't watching the match. His eyes were fixed on something else entirely, on Seraphina's family, sitting in the commoner section. Alan's blood turned to ice. Seraphina's family, her mother, a thin woman with the same silver hair and violet eyes, and her younger brother, a boy of perhaps 10 with his sister's delicate features, had come to watch the final match. They sat in the front row of the commoner section, their faces glowing with pride, completely unaware of the danger they were in. Aldric raised a hand, and Alan saw the faint shimmer of magic gathering around his finger. A spell, a subtle one meant to look like an accident, a heart attack, a sudden illness, something that would kill Seraphina's mother and brother and leave no trace, no evidence, nothing to connect it to the Archmage. And Seraphina would be devastated, broken, her focus shattered at the worst possible moment, leaving her vulnerable to Alara's ice, vulnerable to an accidental, fatal blow. Alan moved. He didn't think, didn't plan, didn't consider the consequences. He simply moved, bursting from the competitor's area and racing toward the commoner section, his legs pumping, his heart pounding, his mind focused on one thing and one thing only. Stop the spell, save her family, save her. He was too far. He knew he was too far. Aldric's spell was already forming, already gathering power, already moments from release. Alan wouldn't reach them in time. But he had something the Archmage didn't expect. He had power he had been hiding for months. Alan reached deep into his mana channels, into the reservoirs he had been carefully expanding during his midnight training, and he pulled. He pulled with everything he had, everything he was, everything he had been in his past life. For one glorious, terrible moment, he stopped hiding, and he screamed. The sound that tore from his throat wasn't the cry of a 16-year-old boy. It was the battle roar of a demon lord, the sound that had made armies flee and heroes tremble. It carried power, raw, ancient, undeniable power, and it slammed into Aldric's spell like a physical force. The spell shattered, the magic dissipated harmlessly in the air, and every single person in the arena turned to stare at the source of that impossible sound. Alan stood in the middle of the commoner section, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with power that no first-year student should possess. Around him, people shrank back, their instincts screaming warnings they couldn't understand. Seraphina's mother clutched her son to her chest, staring at this stranger who had appeared from nowhere. In the arena, the match had stopped. Seraphina and Alara stood frozen, their magic flickering uncertainly, their eyes fixed on Alan. In the royal pavilion, the king rose from his throne, his face a mask of shock and calculation. And in the center of it all, Aldric smiled. "Well, well," the Archmage murmured, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "It seems our young commoner has been hiding more than anyone realized." Alan's heart sank. He had played right into Aldric's hand. The spell on Seraphina's family had been a trap, a test designed to force him to reveal himself, and he had walked into it with his eyes wide open. But as he looked at Seraphina's mother, at the terror in her eyes, at the boy she held so protectively, he couldn't bring himself to regret it. He would do it again, 100 times, 1,000. He would reveal every secret, burn every bridge, sacrifice everything he had built, if it meant keeping Seraphina's family safe. Guards were moving now, converging on his position. Professors were shouting. The crowd was in chaos, half of them trying to flee, half trying to see what was happening. And through it all, Alan stood alone, his power still crackling around him, waiting for whatever came next. Then Seraphina was there. She had run from the arena, abandoning the match, abandoning everything to reach him. She pushed through the crowd, through the guards, through everyone who tried to stop her, until she stood before him, her eyes searching his face. "Alan," she whispered, "what have you done?" He looked at her, at this girl who had become his entire world, and he made a choice. "I'll explain everything," he said quietly, "but not here, not like this." He looked past her at the guards closing in, at the professors with their spells ready, at Aldric watching from the pavilion with that terrible smile. "Can you trust me? One more time." She didn't hesitate. She took his hand, her white flame mingling with his power, and she nodded. "Always." The guards were 10 feet away when the world exploded, not with fire or ice or any magic anyone had ever seen. It was light, pure, blinding, absolute light that erupted from where Alan and Seraphina stood. It didn't burn. It didn't destroy. It simply blinded, overwhelming every sense, leaving everyone in the arena helpless and disoriented. When the light faded, they were gone. Alan and Seraphina ran through the tunnels beneath the academy, hand in hand, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. Alan knew these passages from his past life, secret ways used by spies and traitors, forgotten routes that connected the oldest parts of the academy to the world beyond. He had planned for this, prepared for this, hoped he would never need it. But here they were. "Where are we going?" Seraphina gasped, struggling to keep up with his pace. "Away. Somewhere we can talk, somewhere safe." He pulled her around a corner through a hidden door, into a chamber he had prepared months ago. It was small, barely larger than their secret training room, but it held supplies, food, water, blankets, everything they would need to survive for weeks. She stared at the provisions. "You planned this. You knew something like this would happen." "I knew it was possible." He released her hand, moving to the far wall where he sank down with his back against the stone. The power that had exploded from him was gone now, drained, leaving him feeling hollow and exhausted. "I didn't want to believe it would actually come to this." Seraphina knelt before him, her hand reaching out to touch his face. "Alan, tell me, no more secrets, no more hiding. Who are you? What are you?" He looked at her, at the girl he had crossed time to save, and he finally let the mask fall completely away. "My name is Alan," he said quietly, "and I am the demon lord who destroyed the world." She stared at him, her eyes wide, her hand frozen against his cheek. "In my first life," he continued, the words pouring out now that the dam had broken, I was born a commoner just like you. I came to this academy, hungry and ambitious and desperate to prove myself. I watched you get bullied and I did nothing. I watched you suffer and I walked away. I spent 20 years climbing, fighting, conquering, until I became the most powerful being in the world. And on the day I finally won, on the day I finally had everything I ever wanted, I found you dead in the ruins of the capital, killed by the people you tried to protect, killed because I wasn't there to save you. Tears were streaming down his face now, tears he hadn't shed in 20 years. I held your body, Seraphina. I held you and you were cold, you were gone, and I would have given anything, anything to have you back. And then your tear fell on my hand. One tear, warm and impossible, and it tore me apart and put me back together and threw me 20 years into the past. To the day we first met. To the day I first failed you. He reached up, covering her hand with his own. I've been hiding ever since. Hiding who I was, what I knew, what I could do. Because if anyone found out, if Aldric found out, he'd use it. He would use me. He would use you. And I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't lose you again. Seraphina was silent for a long, terrible moment. Her face was unreadable, her emotions hidden behind a mask he couldn't penetrate. Then she did something he never expected. She laughed. It wasn't a cruel laugh or a mocking one. It was a laugh of pure, astonished wonder. "You idiot," she whispered. "You absolute idiot." And then she was in his arms, holding him as tightly as she could, her tears soaking into his shoulder. "You came back. 20 years through time itself, you came back for me. I would come back 1,000 times," he said into her hair. "I would burn the world and build it again. I would fight fate itself. I would do anything, anything to keep you safe." She pulled back, looking at him with eyes that held no fear, no judgment, no doubt. Only love. "Then stop trying to protect me from the truth," she said. "Stop carrying everything alone. We're partners, remember. You and me against the world. That's what you promised." He stared at her, this impossible girl, this miracle he didn't deserve. "I remember." "Good." She wiped her tears and the white flame flickered to life in her palm. "Now tell me everything. About the future, about the war, about Aldric, about how we win." And so he did. He told her about the kingdoms that would fall, the alliances that would shatter, the friends who would become enemies and the enemies who would become monsters. He told her about the battles he had fought, the people he had lost, the mistakes he had made. He told her about the future he had lived and the future he was trying to build. She listened to it all, her face growing graver with each revelation but never showing fear, never flinching, never pulling away. When he finally fell silent, exhausted and drained, she reached out and took his hand. "So Aldric betrays everyone," she said quietly. "Cedric becomes a sword master who fights against us. The church turns on anyone who doesn't follow their doctrine. And the war kills millions." "Yes." She was silent for a moment, processing. Then she looked up at him with eyes that burned with the same fire that lived in her palm. "Then we change it, all of it. We save the people who can be saved, we stop the ones who can be stopped, and we build something better than what came before." She squeezed his hand. Together. Alan looked at her. This girl who had just learned that the boy she loved was a monster from the future, who had just heard horrors that would break most people, who had just been given every reason to run and had chosen to stay. And he felt something he hadn't felt in 2 lifetimes. He felt at peace. Together, he agreed. Above them, far above, the academy churned with chaos and confusion. Guards searched everywhere. Professors argued about what to do. The king demanded answers. Aldric smiled in the shadows, already planning his next move. But in the depths beneath it all, 2 people held each other in the darkness and prepared to change the world. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. 3 days they spent in the darkness beneath the academy. 3 days of planning, of talking, of learning each other's secrets. Seraphina asked endless questions about the future, about the war, about the people Alan had been and the things he had done. She didn't flinch from the darkest answers, didn't judge him for the sins of his past life. Instead, she listened and she learned, and she helped him see his own history through new eyes. "You were alone," she said on the second night, her voice soft in the candlelight. "All that time, all that power, and you were completely alone. No wonder you became what you became." "I made choices," Alan replied quietly. "Terrible choices. I can't blame loneliness for everything." "No, but you can understand it." She reached for his hand. "And now you're not alone anymore. None of us are." On the 3rd day, Ren found them. The future spymaster had tracked them through tunnels even Alan hadn't known existed, his network of invisible observers piecing together their likely route. He appeared in the doorway of their hideout like a ghost, his pale face showing no emotion, but his eyes, when they fell on Alan, held something new. "Respect. The academy is in chaos," he reported. "Half the professors want you arrested, the other half want to study you. The king has demanded answers, and Aldric—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Aldric is playing all sides, presenting himself as the reasonable voice, the one who can handle this situation without violence. Everyone trusts him." Alan nodded grimly. "That's exactly what he wants. He's positioning himself as the solution to a problem he created." "Myra and Kale are safe," Ren continued. "They've been questioned but released. No evidence connecting them to you, for now." He looked at Seraphina. "Your family is being protected. The king assigned guards after the incident. They're frightened but unharmed." Seraphina's shoulders sagged with relief. "Can we see them?" "Not yet, too dangerous, but I can get messages to them." Ren's eyes flicked to Alan. "What now? We can't stay hidden forever. Eventually they'll find this place. Or we'll run out of supplies. We need a plan." Alan rose, moving to the center of the room. The candles flickered as he passed, responding to the power that still thrummed beneath his skin. "We stop hiding," he said. "Not recklessly, not yet. But we've been reacting to Aldric's moves, playing his game, letting him control the board. That ends now." He turned to face them, Ren the shadow, Seraphina the light, and in his mind Myra and Kale waiting somewhere above. "We know what Aldric really is. We know what he planned. That's an advantage he doesn't expect. And we have something else, each other. A network of people who trust each other, who die for each other. Aldric has power, centuries, but he doesn't have that. He can't understand it." Seraphina rose to stand beside him. "So what's the first move?" Alan smiled, and it was the smile of a demon lord who had finally found something worth fighting for. "We go public." The academy courtyard was packed when they emerged from the tunnels. Word had spread through Ren's network. The fugitives would surface at noon, would speak their truth to whoever would listen. Thousands had gathered, students and professors and visitors, their faces a mixture of curiosity, hostility, and hope. Guards surrounded the entrance they'd chosen, their hands on their weapons. Professors stood ready with containment spells, and in a place of honor near the front, Aldric waited, his ancient face arranged in an expression of paternal concern. Alan stepped into the light first, Seraphina beside him, Ren a shadow at their backs. The crowd stirred. Whispers rippled through them like wind through wheat. "Alan of no family name," the headmaster began, stepping forward with all the authority of his office. "You stand accused of—" "I stand accused of nothing," Alan interrupted, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the power of his past life behind it. "I've broken no academy rules. I've harmed no one. My only crime is having power I didn't reveal soon enough." The headmaster's face reddened. "You attacked the Archmage spell. You revealed abilities far beyond what a first-year should possess. I protected innocent people from an attack they didn't even know was coming." Alan's eyes found Aldric, and the Archmage's smile didn't waver. "Ask yourself, headmaster, why would a first-year student need to hide his power? What threat could possibly justify such deception?" The crowd murmured. Aldric's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "This is a distraction," the Archmage said smoothly, stepping forward. "The boy is trying to deflect attention from his own actions. I'm sure we all sympathize with his desire to protect." "Protect from what?" Seraphina's voice cut through his words like a blade. "From a spell that was aimed at my mother and my little brother. From an accident that would have killed them both." She turned to face the crowd, her white flame flickering to life in her palm. "Ask yourselves who benefits from my family's death, who wants me broken and alone, easy to manipulate, easy to control." The whispers grew louder. Eyes turned toward Aldric, toward the Archmage who had been so helpful, so reasonable, so eager to resolve the situation. Aldric's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his ancient eyes, something dangerous. "This is absurd," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. "You're suggesting I would harm innocent civilians. I who have served this academy for 300 years. I who have trained generations of mages. This commoner girl dares to. She dares to tell the truth." Alan stepped forward, and for just a moment he let his power flare, not attacking, just revealing. just enough for everyone in that courtyard to feel it, to understand that this boy was something more than he. You've spent centuries building your reputation, Aldric. Centuries making yourself indispensable, untouchable, beyond suspicion. But I've seen what you really are. I've seen the future you're trying to create. The crowd went absolutely silent. Aldric's face was a mask, but behind it, Alan could see the calculations racing. How much did the boy know? How could he know it? What threat did he actually pose? You're mad, the Archmage said flatly. Dangerously mad. You've clearly been affected by whatever power you've been hiding. I'm not mad. Alan's voice was quiet now, but it carried. I'm not lying, and I can prove it. He turned to face the crowd, to face the professors, to face the king himself, who had emerged from his pavilion to watch this confrontation. 3 days from now, a caravan will be attacked on the northern road. Bandits, everyone will assume, but the attack will be led by a man with gray robes and a staff topped with a crimson crystal, one of Aldric's agents, testing a new weapon on innocent travelers. The weapon will fail, the agent will flee, and the survivors will describe exactly what I'm telling you now. Aldric laughed, but there was an edge to it. Fortune-telling, prophecy, this is your proof. Wait 3 days, Alan said simply. If I'm wrong, do whatever you want with me. Execute me publicly. I won't resist, but if I'm right. He let the implication hang. The crowd erupted. Arguments broke out everywhere, some believing, some scoffing, most uncertain. The professors huddled together, debating. The king watched with sharp, calculating eyes, and Aldric stood frozen, his ancient face finally showing something fear. The 3 days that followed were the longest of Alan's life. He and Seraphina were confined to quarters, not a cell. The headmaster had insisted, just comfortable rooms where they could be protected until the truth of Alan's claim was tested. Guards watched every door. Professors monitored every magical emission, and through it all, Wren's network kept them informed of everything happening outside. Aldric had gone quiet, too quiet. He hadn't appeared publicly since the confrontation, hadn't made any statements, hadn't done anything to defend himself. His silence was more frightening than any attack. He's planning something, Wren reported on the second night, appearing in their room through means no one had detected. His agents are moving, but I can't track them all. Whatever happens in the next 24 hours, it won't be straightforward. Alan nodded grimly. He had expected this. Aldric was too smart to simply wait for the prophecy to be proven or disproven. He would act, would try to shape events to his advantage. The question was how. The answer came on the 3rd morning. A messenger arrived at dawn, bearing news that made the entire academy freeze. The Northern Road caravan had been attacked, exactly as Alan had described. Bandits, or men dressed as bandits, had struck at dawn, killing 3 guards before being driven off. The survivors' descriptions matched Alan's prediction perfectly. Gray robes, a staff with a crimson crystal, a man who fled when his weapon malfunctioned. The proof was undeniable, but Aldric had already moved. At the exact moment the attack was happening, the Archmage had been in the royal pavilion, meeting with the king. Dozens of witnesses could attest to his presence. He had an alibi, a perfect, unshakable alibi that placed him far from the scene of the crime. When the news arrived, Aldric expressed shock, outrage, a demand for a full investigation to find the impostor who had used his reputation for such terrible purposes. And just like that, he had turned Alan's proof against him. See, he told the gathered nobles, the boy's prophecy was correct, but it proves nothing about me. Someone is impersonating my agents, using my name to commit atrocity. The question is, who benefits from making me look guilty? The implication was clear. Alan. Alan, with his mysterious power and his hidden knowledge. Alan, who had somehow predicted an attack that Aldric couldn't possibly have committed. The suspicion shifted. The whispers changed. Alan sat in his room, listening to Wren's report, and felt the trap closing around him. He's good, he admitted. I have to give him that. He turned my best move into his advantage. Seraphina sat beside him, her hand in his. What do we do now? Alan was silent for a long moment, thinking. Aldric had centuries of experience manipulating people, shaping events, controlling narrative. Every move Alan made would be anticipated, countered, used against him. Unless he stopped playing the game Aldric expected. We need to change the board, he said slowly. Aldric has spent centuries building power in the light, reputation, influence, official position. But he also has power in the shadows, agents, spies, hidden weapon. He expects us to fight him in one of those arenas, light or shadow. But what's the third option? Seraphina asked. Alan smiled. The heart. He turned to Ren. I need you to find someone. A woman about 50 years old with graying hair and a scar on her left cheek. She lives in the poorest district of the capital in a house with a blue door. Her name is Ilara, not the ice mage, a different Ilara. She's the mother of a boy who died in an accident 10 years ago. An accident that happened while he was working as a servant in the Western Tower. Ren's eyes widened slightly. Aldric, one of his earliest experiments. The boy had potential, real potential, and Aldric tried to use him. When the boy resisted, he was eliminated. The official story was a fall. The mother never believed. Ren was already moving toward the door. I'll find her. When he was gone, Seraphina looked at Alan with wonder in her eyes. You knew about her, from your past life, from the investigations after the war. When we finally defeated Aldric, we found records of everything, every victim, every experiment, every family destroyed. His voice was bitter. We were too late to save them, but maybe we're not too late to use their stories now. The next day, everything changed. Ilara, the mother, not the mage, came to the academy. She was exactly as Alan had described. 50 years old, graying hair, a scar on her left cheek from a childhood accident. She wore her best dress, threadbare but clean, and she walked through the gates with the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing left to lose. She asked to speak to the king. The courtiers tried to dismiss her, to send her away, to pretend she didn't exist. But she wouldn't be dismissed. She stood in the middle of the courtyard, her voice rising above the protest, and she told her story. About her son, about his job at the Western Tower, about the night he didn't come home, about the official story, a tragic accident, a fall from the stairs, and about the wounds on his body that didn't match. Wounds that looked like they came from magic. Wounds that glowed faintly in the dark for days after his death. She had kept his body, had refused to let the authorities take it, had hidden it in her cellar for 10 years, waiting for someone to listen, someone to care, someone to believe. Now she was offering it as proof. The crowd that gathered to hear her story grew and grew. By the time she finished, there were thousands listening. Students, professors, merchants, noble, and in their eyes was something new. Doubt. Aldric appeared at the height of the commotion, his face a mask of righteous indignation. This is absurd, he declared. This woman is clearly deranged by grief. Her son's death was a tragedy, yes, but an accident. I have records, witnesses, proof. Then show them, Alan said, stepping forward with Seraphina beside him. Open your tower. Let investigators examine the scene. Let healers examine the body. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. The crowd murmured agreement. Aldric's face flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been panic. This is an outrageous demand. The Western Tower contains centuries of research, artifacts of immense power, secrets that are more important than a dead boy's memory. The king's voice cut through the argument like a blade. He had emerged from his pavilion, his face unreadable. Secrets that justify refusing an investigation into a possible murder. Aldric's mouth opened and closed. For the first time in centuries, he had no words. The king nodded slowly. The tower will be open. Investigators will examine everything. And if this woman's claims prove true, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The crowd erupted. Cheers, arguments, chaos. But beneath it all, a current of something new. Hope. The mighty Archmage, the untouchable legend, was finally being questioned. Alan caught Aldric's eye across the crowd. For just a moment, the mask slipped completely, and Alan saw what lay beneath: rage, hatred, and something else. Fear. Real fear. The investigation took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of digging through ancient records, examining hidden chambers, interviewing servants who had been too afraid to speak for decades. 3 weeks of revelations that shocked the kingdom to its core. Aldric's tower was a monument to horror, secret laboratories where he had experimented on unwilling subjects, prison cells holding people who had been missing for years, records of murders, disappearances, betrayals stretching back centuries. Ilara's son was just one victim among hundreds. When the final report was presented to the king, the Archmage's fate was sealed. He was stripped of his titles, his positions, his power. The Western Tower was sealed. His agents were hunted down and arrested, but Aldric himself was gone. When investigators finally reached his private chamber, they found only a single note, written in ancient script and addressed to Alan. "You've won this round, boy, but the game is far from over. I have centuries of experience, resources you can't imagine, allies you've never heard of. I will return, and when I do, everyone you love will suffer for what you've done." Alan read the note in silence, Seraphina looking over his shoulder. When he finished, he folded it carefully and tucked it into his pocket. "He's not wrong," he said quietly. "This isn't over, it's barely begun." Seraphina took his hand. "Then we'll be ready. We'll build something he can't destroy. We'll protect each other." Alan looked at her, at this girl who had become his anchor, his hope, his reason for fighting. Around them, the academy was still celebrating. The tyrant fallen, the truth. But Alan knew better. Aldric was out there somewhere planning his return. But for now, for this moment, they had won. The final bell of the semester tolled across the academy, calling students to the closing ceremony. Alan and Seraphina walked together through the crowd, their hands linked, their hearts full. In the training grounds, their family waited. Ren, already planning networks that would span the kingdom. Myra, her healing hands ready for whatever wounds the future would bring. Kale, his rage finally channeled into something protective, something noble. And dozens more, commoners and outcasts and forgotten souls who had found purpose in their cause. They stood together as the sun set over the academy, painting the spires in shades of gold and rose. The world was young again, full of possibility and promise. Alan looked at them, his family, his hope, his reason for being, and felt something he had never expected to feel again. Peace. But even as the warmth spread through his chest, even as Seraphina's hand tightened in his, even as his friends laughed and celebrated around him, Alan knew the truth. Aldric was out there, the war was coming, and the future he had lived once was still waiting to be changed. But this time, he wouldn't face it alone. This time, he had a demon lord's knowledge, a saintess's love, and a family of misfits who would follow him into hell itself. Let the future come. They were ready. The demon lord and his saintess stood united at last, and the world would never be the same. The story never truly ended. It passed from grandmother to granddaughter, from father to son, from teacher to student. Each generation added their own chapters, their own heroes, their own moments of light pushing back against darkness. The names changed, but the heart remained the same. In the centuries that followed, the kingdom Alan and Seraphina had helped build grew into something neither of them could have imagined. It became an empire, then a collection of nations, then a memory preserved in books and songs, and the quiet places where old stones still stood. The Western Tower crumbled, then was rebuilt as a library, then a school, then a monument. Children played in its shadows, unaware that it had once held horrors. Students studied in its halls, unaware that an archmage had once plotted there. Lovers met on its steps, unaware that a demon lord had once climbed them with death in his heart. Time softened everything. Myra's hospitals evolved into something beyond her wildest dreams. Healing magic that had once been rare became common. Diseases that had once killed millions were eradicated. The average lifespan doubled, then tripled. People who would have died in infancy now lived to see their great-great-grandchildren. Kale's guardians became legend, then tradition, then simply the police forces that kept order in every city. Their symbol, a shield with a flame at its center, still appeared on uniforms and buildings, a reminder that protection was sacred. Ren's networks became the foundation of intelligence agencies across the continent. Spies still operated in shadow, but they did so with codes of conduct, with oversight, with the understanding that knowledge existed to protect, not to control. And the story of the demon lord and the saintess, that became something else entirely. It became myth. In some versions, they were kings who had walked among mortals. In others, they were ordinary people who had done extraordinary things. In the most accurate versions, preserved in dusty archives and whispered by scholars, they were simply two people who had loved each other enough to change the world. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. 500 years later, the girl's name was Lyra, and she was nobody special. She lived in a village that appeared on no maps, in a cottage that had been in her family for generations, with parents who loved her and siblings who annoyed her, and a future that stretched before her like a well-worn path. She would marry a local boy probably, have children definitely, grow old certainly, die eventually like everyone else. But Lyra had a secret. She dreamed, not ordinary dreams, dreams of fire and shadow, of battles fought under strange skies, of a man with ancient eyes and a woman with light in her palms. Dreams that felt more real than waking, that left her gasping and confused, that made her wonder if she was losing her mind. Her grandmother, when she asked, had gone pale. "Those dreams," the old woman whispered. "What do you see? Tell me everything." Lyra described them, the throne of ashes, the white flame, the tear that fell through time. Her grandmother listened in silence, her face growing more and more troubled. "There's a story," she said finally, "passed down in our family for 500 years, about a girl who saved the world with a single tear, about a boy who loved her across time." She gripped Lyra's hand. "You're not the first to have those dreams, child. Every few generations, one of us is born who remembers, who sees, who carries the legacy forward." Lyra stared at her. "You're saying I'm related to them, to the demon lord and the Saintess?" Her grandmother smiled sadly. "We're all related to them, child. Their blood runs in half the kingdom by now, but some of us carry more than blood, we carry memory." She touched Lyra's chest, right over her heart. "You have the flame, child. I've seen it flicker in your eyes since you were born. I was hoping you'd be spared, that the dreams would pass you by, but they haven't." Lyra didn't understand, didn't want to understand. She was nobody special. She was just a girl from a village that appeared on no maps. But that night the dreams came again, and this time someone else was there. She stood on a hill overlooking a battlefield. The dead lay everywhere, friend and enemy alike, their blood soaking into soil that would never forget. The sky was red with sunset, or maybe with fire, or maybe with something else entirely. And beside her stood a woman with silver hair and violet eyes. "Hello, Lyra," the woman said gently. "I've been waiting for—" Lyra couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare at this figure from her dreams, from her family's stories, from the legends that every child learned in school. You're her, the Saintess, Seraphina." The woman smiled. I am, I will always be." She reached out and her hand was warm against Lyra's cheek. "You have my blood, child, and more than that, you have my gift. The flame has chosen you just as it chose me, just as it chooses one in every generation." Lyra shook her head, backing away. "I don't want it. I don't want any of this. I'm nobody. I just want to live my life, marry a local boy, have children, grow old, die like everyone else." Seraphina's eyes held infinite understanding. "I know, I wanted the same thing once, before the flame found me, before Alan found me, before I found myself." She stepped closer and her presence was like sunlight, warm and gentle and impossible to resist. "The flame doesn't ask permission, Lyra. It simply is, and now it's yours." "Why?" The word burst out of her, raw and desperate. "Why me? Why now? The world doesn't need saving anymore. The wars are over. The darkness is gone. What am I supposed to do with this?" Seraphina looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned, gesturing at the battlefield that surrounded them. "Do you know where this is?" she asked quietly. Lyra shook her head. "This is the field where we defeated Aldric 500 years ago. The battle that ended the war, that saved the kingdom, that changed everything." She looked at Lyra with those ancient eyes. "And do you know what I felt, standing here after it was over?" "What?" "Nothing." Seraphina's voice was soft, sad. "Victory, yes. Relief, certainly. But also empty. Because I knew even then that this wasn't the end. That darkness would always return. That the work of protecting the world is never finished." She turned back to Lyra. "You asked what you're supposed to do. The answer is simple. Watch. Wait. Be ready. The flame chose you because somewhere, somehow, a threat is gathering. Maybe small, maybe large, maybe far away, maybe close. But it's coming. And when it does, you'll know, you'll feel it, and you'll act." Lyra wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, wanted to wake up from this dream and forget it had ever happened. But even as she thought it, she felt something stir in her chest. A warmth, a light, a flame that had been sleeping for 500 years, waiting for someone to carry it forward. "I don't know how," she whispered. Seraphina smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise. "You don't have to. The flame knows. Trust it. Trust yourself. And when the time comes, remember, you're not alone. You never were." She began to fade, her form growing transparent, her light dimming. Wait, Lyra cried. Please, I have so many questions I don't understand. You will. Seraphina's voice was barely a whisper now, carried on a wind that didn't exist. In time you will. And Lyra, yes, tell the story. When the time is right, tell the story. It's the most important thing you'll ever do. She vanished. Lyra woke in her bed, gasping, her heart pounding. Sunlight streamed through her window, ordinary and warm. Birds sang outside. Her siblings argued about breakfast in the next room. Everything was normal, but when she looked at her hands, she saw it. A flicker of white flame dancing across her palms, waiting for her to begin. 1,000 years later, the girl's name was no longer remembered. She lived in a city of glass and light, where magic had been woven into every aspect of life, where children learned the old stories in schools but mostly ignored them, where the past was a distant echo that no one quite believed. But she dreamed, dreams of fire and shadow, of battles fought under strange skies, of a man with ancient eyes and a woman with light in her palm. Dreams that felt more real than waking, that left her gasping and confused, that made her wonder if she was losing her mind. Her mother, when she asked, had smiled. Those dreams, she said gently, they run in our family, have for thousands of years. She touched her daughter's chest, right over her heart. You have the flame, child, just like I did, just like my mother did, just like every generation back to the beginning. The girl stared at her. The beginning, you mean? I mean the demon lord and the saintess. Her mother's eyes were warm, understanding. Their blood runs in us. Their legacy lives in us. And when the time comes, you'll know what to do. The girl didn't understand, didn't want to understand. She was just a girl in a city of glass and light, with a future that stretched before her like a well-worn path. But that night the dreams came again, and this time someone was waiting for her, a woman with silver hair and violet eyes, standing on a hill overlooking a battlefield that no longer existed. "Hello," the woman said gently. "I've been waiting for—" The girl stared, her heart pounding. You're her, the Saintess, Seraphina." The woman smiled. I am, I will always be." She reached out and her hand was warm. "The flame has chosen you, child, just as it chose me, just as it chooses one in every generation." The girl wanted to argue, to refuse to wake up. But even as she thought it, she felt something stir in her chest. A warmth, a light, a flame, waiting to be carried forward. "What do I do?" she whispered. Seraphina smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise. "Tell the story," she said. "When the time is right, tell the story. It's the most important thing you'll ever do." The girl woke in her bed, the morning light streaming through her window, the city of glass and light humming with life around her. And in her palm, just for a moment, a white flame flickered, waiting. The story continues, forever, in a place beyond time, beyond space, beyond the boundaries of existence itself. Two figures sat together on a hill overlooking infinity. Below them, countless worlds turned, each with its own heroes, its own villain, its own stories of love and loss and second chances. The flame had spread far beyond the world where it began, carried by blood and memory and the unbreakable chain of legacy. "She's doing well," Seraphina said softly, watching a girl in a city of glass and light who had just woken from a dream. Alan nodded, his hand in hers. "They all do. Will it ever end? The cycle, the need for someone to carry the flame." He considered the question, turning it over in his mind as he had for millennia. "I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe the world will always need protecting. Maybe darkness will always rise, and light will always rise to meet it." Seraphina leaned against him, her head on his shoulder. "That sounds exhausting." He laughed softly. "It is, but it's also beautiful. Look at them. All those lives, all those stories, all those moments of courage and love and hope. They're all connected, all part of something larger than themselves." Below them, the girl in the city of glass and light rose from her bed, looked at her palm and smiled. The flame flickered. The story continued, and two figures watched from beyond time, hand in hand forever.